American Football Stories is brought to you by Coach Paint. Coach Paint is a great tool that allows us to add graphics to player highlight clips similar to the graphics you see on TV. Coach Paint offers the ability to clearly tellustrate video while increasing retention of information in a shorter amount of time. Up your game with Coach Paint today.
What time is it? Game time! It's gonna be special. They gonna talk about this forever.
Welcome to American Football Stories.
Puts his head down, crashes and spins, and dives. Touchdown!
Bringing together the many perspectives that make up college football in the NFL.
Football is one of the greatest sports ever invented.
From players and coaches.
Believe, baby, believe, baby.
Hey, we playing to win right here, fellas.
To the front office and scouts.
The public is finally beginning to catch up, but they don't even know half the truth.
Us against the world, let's get it.
Your hosts, Robert Parker and Nick Knudsen, bring you American Football Stories.
Welcome to the American Football Stories podcast brought to you by Coach Paint. My name is Nick Knudsen, joined by my co-host Robert Parker. Today is March 16th, 2021, and we welcome Mark Jarvis from the NFL Draft Bible, presented by Sports Illustrated, onto the podcast tonight. Mark, thanks for joining the show, man.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, we're looking forward to it. Hey, you seem to have an interesting story from a little bit of stalking I did on Twitter there. So my understanding is you started a website called What's on Draft, which, by the way, I was actually I was talking to my dad earlier, and I was telling him about your site, What's on Draft. He's like, great name. So you got approval from my pops on that name. I like that name too, though.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I always was trying to figure out a great website name. I spent probably a year and a half what's the right move? How can I make it as appealing as possible? What's catchy? And I ended up settling on a beer pun, which isn't the greatest of beer puns, but it was better than most of the stuff I saw out there, so I just rolled with it.
That's great, man. So how long did you work on that site before you now work with Sports Illustrated? So clearly that went well. How long did you work on that site for before moving over to SI?
I started it in November of 2016, and I think I closed it in December of this past year, so about 4 years and some change.
Hey, man, that's great. That's great. And have you just always been into scouting, or what got you into that over time?
Well, initially it was more of just on the side fandom type thing of, I just love watching the NFL and being interested in football. I did fantasy football for a while. I always played Madden. I'm like, okay, cool. That's scouting something that I didn't really pay attention to. But then I started I was really heavy into forums and stuff like that. I'd go on there and just throw my opinion on, here's what I think about these QBs sort of thing with the NFL. And every time when draft season would roll around, people would post there, this is my big board. These are my rankings. I'm like, okay, let me just see what this is, give it a shot. And I threw together some big boards and some rankings and some mock drafts just to have some fun. And then after about 2 years of just messing around doing that and just doing it as a very casual thing, I wrote my first scouting report, and I was hooked. I fell in love with just writing scouting reports all the time, and it slowly turned into what it is now of just let me watch every guy I possibly can and write them up. And so it just, once I started writing scouting reports, it just kind of snowballed downhill.
That's awesome.
That's awesome stuff right there.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, if you want to see scouting report after scouting report, check out the NFL Draft Bible. You guys have just article after article. You guys are rounds and rounds deep. This is not like 7 different mock drafts of the first round type of website. You guys are going into the 6th, 7th undrafted guys. You got scouting reports on everyone out there.
Yeah, we get into the weeds a little bit, and we're just getting started. Next year, we're going to take it up to another level too. So we've got a lot of those lower end guys that maybe you're only going to hear about them for a year or two. Maybe they're a practice squad guy, but we're going to have you covered on those guys.
Well, that's actually, so that's one of the things we were most fired up about having you on the show about, because you really do. You hear all the scenarios for the first rounds, and maybe this team will trade into that. And then usually they're all wrong, and it's just all blown up by draft night. And then there's a whole other 6 rounds to worry about that you're like, I've spent so much time worried about who we're going to draft with the first pick that I completely need to figure out what we're doing the rest of the draft. So I think that's what we're going to try to go a little deeper. We'll talk about some of the top guys here, but we want to go a little beyond that first round there. But as a Jaguars fan, I'm used to focusing on top 5 pick in the first round. That's usually why. That's like Robert's a Vikings fan, so he gets a little more of a break than I do on some of that stuff. But
he gets to pick in the 20s. He's fine.
I have one question that I know a lot of people have. You hear about like taking the best player available in the draft versus drafting for need. What percentage of the league do you feel? And obviously, there's no right answer on this, but right now there's so much pressure on coaches to win right away as well. So how many developmental picks are we looking at anymore these days at the top of the draft? Are we seeing like most teams, you feel like they're picking for guys who can start almost immediately in the first 2 rounds, or you don't really see too many developmental picks? Like I'll give you an example with my Jaguars. Taven Bryan was a developmental pick a couple years ago on the defensive line when they had that great defensive front with Calais Campbell and Yannick Ngakoue and all those guys. What do you really see? Are you seeing a new trend in that over the last couple of years since you've been doing this?
Yeah, and I don't know if it's something that's unique to just the past few years that I've been doing this, but it just seems in general like the emphasis is on we need a guy. If we're going to take him round 1, he's got to be a contributor. If it's a quarterback, maybe you give him a year or 2 to develop, but if it's any other position, he's got to be a contributor immediately. You don't have the 2-3 years that you used to have to develop, because now your coach isn't winning games within 2-3 years. You're out the door. These guys don't have the kind of tenure that they had in the past, back in the 70s and 80s, right? Where they don't get as much of that long leash to work with. So I think the increased emphasis on win now leads to a lot of picks of what can he do for me right now walking into the building versus maybe I can build this guy up and give him some time.
And just to piggyback off Nick's question, Mark, we kind of see that, for the college kids that's making that transition from high school to college, now we're seeing, true freshmen come in and playing right away. So by the time they hit their junior year or senior year, if you're a front office personnel, GM or scout, you kind of thinking like, okay, well, this guy's going to come in and contribute right away because, they've kind of had that time under their belt making that transition from high school to college.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I guess there's almost like an emphasis on getting guys through the system quicker in a lot of ways. Of now we have used to, and going back to like early 2000s, you'd see just a few juniors declare. Now you see hundreds. So there's this emphasis on just keep sending in fresh bodies and see what works to a certain extent, which I don't think is necessarily the best approach. I think a lot of these guys would be better served going back to school, but that's a topic probably for another day.
Yeah, you're probably right on that one. So with that one, Mark, I just want to transition and just dive right into the draft at the quarterback position. So recently, Chris Sims kind of, made a lot of news out there by, his positional group and rankings. So he had, Zach Wilson over Trevor Lawrence, and he said, Kellen Mond over Justin Fields. And he talked about Kellen Mond being one of the most, pure throwers in this draft class that's coming out. So what are your sentiments in regards to, Chris Sims and his ranking from the quarterback position?
I'll say this is I've had a lot of peculiar rankings and opinions in my past. I've had some, even going back to last draft, I had some really odd opinions on players. So I never want to kind of say, oh, this guy's wrong necessarily. Like, unless I've sat in the film room and watched tape with Chris Sims, I don't know what he sees. I see it differently. I don't think Mond is that special as a pure thrower. I think he has a lot of arm talent to work with. I think the upside is there, but I definitely don't see the more natural pure thrower than Trevor Lawrence. I don't get that at all. But again, he sees what he sees. Everyone's going to see the tape a little bit differently. Personally, I would not have Wilson over Lawrence. I think Lawrence is, in my opinion, I want to say head and shoulders over the rest of the class. I think accuracy on the deep ball is better than what Wilson has. I think there's a little bit less in terms of being able to create outside of structure. Wilson's more natural with altering his mechanics when he's on the move. Just a little bit, I want to say more natural for thrower off platform. But I think Lawrence has better physical tools to work with. I think what he gives you in terms of accuracy at all levels of the field is better than what Wilson has right now. It's not like it's a runaway thing necessarily. It's not like Lawrence is, he's a future Hall of Famer and Wilson's just awful. But I think it's a significant enough gap to where I would say comfortably Lawrence won, and then Wilson's a cut below that.
Got you. So coming into this past season, it kind of seemed like, Trevor Lawrence and Justin Fields were that 1A, 1B for the quarterback position that might go at the number 1 pick. But, during the season, we kind of seen Justin Fields struggle a little bit. And, he kind of got banged up later on in the year. What could you just emphasize and just talk about, Justin Fields, sliding down in the draft process right about now? What are those variables that's actually, making him, slide down the draft and have these other guys kind of come up, like the Zach Wilsons, the Kellen Monds, and, the Trey Lances of the world?
Yeah, I will say I think Fields, at least from what I remember seeing of him in 2019 versus what I saw this year, it seems like he's regressed a little bit. It seems like he was a little bit slower in terms of throwing with anticipation, hitting guys right as they're getting out of the breaks. It seemed like he was waiting and wanting to see things open up a little bit. At times, he was kind of forced to play hero ball a little bit and then made mistakes that you didn't really want to see. I thought the surge of Zach Wilson and Mac Jones is more the story of, it's not necessarily Fields having a big fall off a cliff. I think he did have a down year relative to last year, but it's not like he's falling out of the first round. It's not like he's a terrible prospect or anything. It's just some of these other guys rose and he had a down year and didn't really show the kind of progression that we wanted to see out of him. So he goes from being that 1A, 1B with Trevor Lawrence to being, okay, maybe he's that kind of like tier below a guy like Zach Wilson or a guy like Mac Jones.
Gotcha. So just going to dive in, just like Nick mentioned, like you guys do a good job in the NFL Draft Bible. But one name that kind of jumped out to me is Davis Mills from Stanford. You guys have him ranked 6th in the quarterback rankings, ahead of the likes of Kyle Trask, Ian Book, and Kellen Mond. Could you just talk about Davis Mills and his, progression, as sliding up the draft process?
Yeah, and Mills is an interesting one because he's a guy who doesn't have a ton of experience. He took over the job from Costello when Costello was hurt in 2019, but he doesn't have a ton of reps on him. He's a guy that kind of sat and waited for his turn. This past year obviously was shortened by COVID, so we didn't get to see him for a full campaign. I would love to see a lot of tape on him just because I had a tough time getting a really good feel for him watching him, because he's got a very strong arm. He has some great flashes in terms of throwing man-to-man leverage. He has a great understanding of where to place the ball, give his guy the best possible opportunity to go up and get it in contested situations. But I wish he would have been able to get a little bit more time and experience to show, okay, how quickly can he go and process information? How quickly can he, if things break down, can he find outlets? I wish there was just more consistency in that regard. And I wish I got to see, I guess, more tape on him in general, because the sample size he's leaving college with isn't great. But the physical tools are there, in my opinion. I think, obviously, I mentioned the strong arm. I think he's a smart decision maker. He's not going to put the ball in danger, especially in those man coverage situations where he's just reading leverage and giving his guy the best pass possible. I think there's a lot of things to love with him from a tool standpoint, but he is, I think, a cut below a lot of the other guys like a Jones and a Lance and a Fields, because, again, the sample size, and you just wish there was more to kind of take in with him and say, okay, what's this guy going to be when he comes in the league? Is he going to be a backup? Is he going to be a starter? We don't really know based on what we've seen so far. It's tough to kind of take what he did and extrapolate that to an NFL projection.
Gotcha, Mark. So I'll be remiss to not let you off the quarterback hot seat by asking you, who is your favorite potential sleeper out of the quarterback group, in this upcoming draft?
Yeah, I probably would have had some different answers, but I'm going to be honest with you. There are a lot of quarterbacks that went back to school. I just remember editing my database, and I kept probably 60 quarterbacks in there, and I remember just red name of guys that I'm like, okay, he's going to 2022, and I probably had at least 30 guys that I moved over to 2022, guys like Dustin Crum going back to school. So, but if I had to pick one for this class, I would say Sam Ehlinger. I think he gets a lot of crap because, the whole Texas is back thing was controversial, and he's not necessarily the greatest arm talent or the greatest, most natural passer by any means. But I think when you think about what you really value in a backup quarterback, you need a guy who's going to keep drives alive. He's going to keep your team alive. And I think Ehlinger can do that because he has enough with his legs to where he can extend plays. He can find enough chunk yardage to where he can create first downs. I think in the short and intermediate game, while he's not going to be perfect with his accuracy, it's enough to where you can survive. So I think Ehlinger, if you're talking about him as a 5th, 6th round guy who's going to be a backup who may be a spot starter, maybe an emergency starter if your quarterback gets hurt, I think he's good value at that range.
Yeah. Now, in regards to Sam Ellinger, one thing that kind of jumped out at me, I actually had an opportunity to go down to the Senior Bowl, and I got to see him, up close and personal. And one thing I can kind of say, he's a competitor. He is fiery. He is a competitor. And just like you said, from that quarterback position, that's somebody that you kind of want to bring on your team. Maybe not necessarily as a starter, but, a backup that can kind of, if your quarterback goes down, he can kind of come in there and win a couple games, get the guys riled up and kind of complete some drives. So I think you're spot on with that one.
Yeah, you mentioned his competitiveness, and I think his toughness is obvious too on tape, because you see him, he will go face first into a linebacker and just drop the pads and play behind him, and you're like, wow, this guy is mean for a guy who you don't usually expect quarterbacks to have that kind of fire in them in a lot of ways. Not saying that you don't have your quarterback's not going to be a competitor, but like you don't see them trying to drop the pads on a linebacker when they're trying to fight for a first down. Often a lot of guys are sliding or trying to dodge out of the way. No, Ellinger's going right through you, so it's his style of play. I mean, it's probably not going to give him as long of a shelf life if he has to play extended time in the NFL in terms of like taking over for a year or two. But I think when you're talking about guys that you really want on your 53 man, or as a guy that you really want as your backup, I think a lot of the traits that he brings are what kind of leads you to have success with those backups.
I like the Dustin Crum reference out of Kent State. I did a little bit of tape on him. I like his game. He's got a fun game, man. He had a couple good. He could tuck it and run too.
He's got a lot of those same similarities that Ellinger has. I think he's a little bit less of a natural thrower, but I was surprised with him going back. I thought he'd be a guy who go ahead and test the waters, but a lot to be excited about with him from a standpoint of, like I said, tough runner, and he's got a little bit to him.
Not a lot of NFL caliber quarterbacks returning to Kent State too. That's some new action for the Golden Flashes. But let's kick it over to the running back position. More of a general question here, and this is not a new topic, but really, as someone who you dive in all the film and you got expert status here, Mark.
Oh, don't ever call me an expert. I told you my background, my origin story. You can't call me an expert off that. So.
That's good. For the key to being an expert is not knowing that you don't know things there. That's good. But hey, why has the running back position been devalued in the NFL draft? I mean, we even saw this year, talked about my Jaguars fandom, Leonard Fournette was key piece of that Super Bowl run for Tampa. So good player, maybe not worth the number 4 pick in the draft though, but still a really solid player. But why are we seeing that? Really, maybe they'll take a swing at a top back that they're excited about, a la Ezekiel Elliott. But why are we seeing the running back position be devalued in the NFL draft?
And see, this is where I can't claim expert status because I don't know the answer to this. I'll give you a half answer here.
Yeah,
I think obviously it's a very hot topic. I think a lot of people see the numbers and see the production that you can get out of a regular old guy off the street in a lot of ways. You can kind of plug in I don't want to say limited back, but a guy who's more of a replaceable player than a guy who's going to be like franchise back. And you're going to get enough production to where it's going to work for you. It's not going to be anything extraordinary, but you can and I hate to use the James Robinson example because James Robinson obviously had a very great season this past year, but realistically, Robinson's probably not going to be a continued 1,500 yard type rusher. He's no Adrian Peterson or anything like that. So, but you can still find guys that can produce, right? But when I look at the position, I think, okay, does the guy create his own yards? That's where I find value in backs. Is the guy going to make yardage that is not necessarily going to be blocked for him? Because if you have a good line, you could stick any old guy back there for the most part that has decent athleticism. You're going to get 700, 800 yards, however much you want to really drive him into the ground and give him carries. He's going to produce on those carries. I think just in general, though, like I said, the replaceable production in a lot of ways, being able to get 700, 800 yards on a guy that maybe you take in the 6th or 7th has led people to say, yeah, we can just not invest in the position. I haven't done enough work personally on the kind of the pros and cons of taking a guy late versus early and what the offset is. And that gets into a whole team building philosophy thing that I don't have the knowledge on. I would say that I'm certainly not in the running backs don't matter group. I'll put that out there, but.
Well, there's a lot of guys too. We see maybe making a position change here, going to the next level. Demetric Felton is one of them out of UCLA. We saw him play more receiver than running back at the Senior Bowl, despite playing running back in college. Now, I even heard Jim Nagy talk about it too, the director of the Senior Bowl, say we wanted to do that to get him more tape at receiver. But do you expect him to make that move in the NFL to receiver?
Yeah, I have him graded as a receiver. He played a lot of 2019 as a receiver. I think he started like 10 or 11 games there. That was when they had Joshua Kelly, who was their main back. So he was obviously getting a lot less opportunities in the backfield with a guy like Kelly back there. But I think, we got to see the best of both worlds, really, because we got a year of him at receiver. We got a year of him at running back. So we kind of know what he does at both those positions. I think at wide receiver, it's more of a natural fit because only about 5'9", 185, 189, somewhere in that ballpark. He doesn't really have the type of frame you're looking for a true running back, in my opinion. I think he'd get banged up if you try to run it between the tackles. I don't think he's a super elusive guy. He's not a guy who's going to wow you with agility, but I think what he brings in terms of he's dynamic after the catch. He's got good burst. He's tough to bring down for a guy who has size. Like, he will drop the pads on you and play physical. I think when you look at a lot of things you value in a slot receiver, right? You've got enough quickness in and out of the break. He's a guy who's going to be able to create, again, yardage after the catch because he's tough, because he's willing to drop the pads and fight you for yardage. And I think there's enough in terms of his technical abilities as a receiver based on he's had the experience. He has the athletic traits to be a really solid slot receiver. I think that's his home at the next level.
So let's stick in the Pac-12. How did you evaluate Jamar Jefferson out of Oregon State? Because that's a guy, I mean, a lot of East Coast people, I don't know how much Oregon State football they're watching, and that's a guy that jumped out a couple times here and there.
I had a really tough time with him. His play speed really worried me. I really want to see what he tests, because I know some people were saying he's going to be a 4.4s, maybe low 4.5s guy. I saw much lower than that. I think he's going to run 4.6s. I just didn't see the burst. I think the vision's fine, but he's not a tackle breaker. Again, what I go back to always is the guy creating yards. And maybe that's not the best judge of how do you kind of identify what a good running back is versus what isn't, but that's kind of what I've over the years come to really value. And he's not a guy who's going to be able to shake you. He's not super agile. He's not super explosive side to side. Like I said, the burst is really average, so he's not going to blow past you when he gets a hole. And he's not the guy who's going to be able to, when you hit him and chop his legs, he's not going to be able to recover. His contact balance is just very So I'm a lot lower than Jefferson on Jefferson than a lot of people are. I think there's a role for him if you get him with the right team and you just kind of let him use his vision and use him as a running back to read the back of the committee. But I don't see him as a guy that you can really bet on as a late round sleeper. I just don't see the physical tools. Hopefully he's going to blow up the pro day and shock me and run a 4.4 or something like that. But it's just not something that I saw on his tape.
Sounds destined to be the fifth running back in the rotation for the Patriots based on your description here. Sounds Belichick, 7th round. Go get him. One guy that can break a lot of tackles, and we certainly saw it from him, and he really saved his best for last at Ohio State, but Trey Sermon. And didn't see it early in the season with Ohio State. Now, granted, you're dealing with COVID issues. You're dealing with literally half a season. So can't really fault the guy too much there. But a guy like Trey Sermon, a lot of hype at Oklahoma, played well at times at Oklahoma, but obviously found himself on the outs to the point where he transfers to Ohio State and then puts on, I mean, the man broke. I remember watching Eddie George set the rushing record at Ohio State when I was like 9 years old in the snow against Illinois in the horseshoe. And Trey Sermon goes out and breaks that rushing record in the Big Ten title game against Northwestern. He's jumping over guys. He's just spinning around people. He's insane. Great game against Clemson too. So how do you look at a guy like that with the and obviously I think his injury in the national title game was a significant thing that didn't get talked about a ton, but I think that was pretty significant for the Ohio State offense there. But how do you look at a guy like that who came on so strong toward the end of his career versus the other 85% that was kind of meh? Like, how do you analyze a guy like that? Because if it's a report card in school, the average probably isn't awesome, but the talent is certainly, you saw some jumping off the page in some big moments.
It's tough. And I try to I write my eval and then I'll look at the stats of, okay, did I watch a game where maybe he was really unproductive or he was productive? But I always want to get the eval done first. So I'm not going in with if I turn on the tape for a game where he had 86 yards and say, oh, he had an average game, and then turn on the tape for a game where he ran for 250 or whatever. If I go in expecting that he's going to run for a ton of yards and that he's going to pop off, then I feel like I'm coming in with some bias. So I always try to get the eval done first. but it does leave you some questions, right? And that's really what the heart of scouting is figuring out the answers to those questions. So you go back to Oklahoma. Well, why wasn't he super productive at Oklahoma? Was it because of the other running the options they had? They had guys like Kennedy Brooks there. I think even back when it was like Rodney Anderson, even though he played a limited amount because of his injuries, they had a very loaded group there for a while. And so that definitely had an impact on his production, especially when you have a guy like Kyler Murray who can run too. Mm-hmm. So it's limiting the opportunities he has. So maybe not necessarily the most statistically productive guy at Oklahoma, but I really liked his tape when I watched him there. He was one of my favorite backs. I thought he was going to be in the class last year, ends up coming back and transferring to Ohio State. And you've got Master Teague there, who's a pretty solid running back. So it limits his opportunities there too. But when you give him the chance to be that workhorse guy, and I think he's got that type of style, he's one of the best backs in the nation, in my opinion. I think he showed that down the stretch when he got the opportunities. You always got to wonder, was it an injury thing that made him less productive at Oklahoma? Was it just the group around him? What was it? But if you feel like you know the answer to that and you feel comfortable with the answer to that, it was just they had a bunch of runners, or he was hurt early on and then he got healthy. If you feel like you know the answer to that, then I don't think you should be afraid of a guy who had like a few really bad games statistically and then just goes wild out of nowhere. Because if he's the same type of runner where he went wild in one game, he could have done it in the other game. He just didn't either get the opportunities, didn't have the right situation set up for him.
So you care more about the traits of the player than the overall production.
Absolutely. And that's what you got to evaluate guys on, is because you can have, and I don't want to pull a name out of a hat here. One of the quarterbacks that you had a list that you sent me of all the sleeper quarterbacks that we have for Draft Bible pretty much, right? And there is one quarterback in there who I graded as a reject, who he was a backup this past season. He got forced in action. He threw for like 350 yards or something like that against a team. And he would just, I hate to say he was a very, very bad player. Like he just didn't have anything, but he was productive that game, right? But then you look at like a Jordan Love against LSU a couple years ago when he was just getting plastered. He got no help. He threw for like 150 yards and 3 interceptions. Well, if you just took the pure numbers, you'd say, oh, well, the guy who threw for 350 or whatever and had 2 TDs did better than Jordan Love. Well, until you turn on the tape, you don't really know what the guy did. So that's why, like I said, I always try to avoid going in with the idea, what's the stats? What's this? I don't know. I just want to make sure he played in the game, so I'm not watching the game and then halfway through realize he's not on the screen. But I don't want to go in thinking, oh, this is a good game or this is a bad game, because you don't know. You don't know what the guy did in the game until you sit down and you watch him play in the game.
All right, let's wrap up the running backs here. I'll kick it over to Rob for the receivers, but one of our favorite sleepers, hey, friend of the podcast, Caleb Duke Huntley out of Ball State, came on a couple weeks ago. Physical runner, under the radar in the MAC. Who do you like? Who's your favorite sleeper, Mark?
That's tough. I feel like there's a lot of depth in this running back class, but no guys that really stand out as like top of the line sleepers. One guy I will throw out here is Jared Dokes from Cincinnati, who I had graded as a possible low end starter, guy who he's had some medical issues in the past, but when you watch him run, he's got good size, plays behind his pads. He's able to create with contact balance. I think his burst through the hole is really surprising. He's not going to burn you going down the field, but if you ask him to just beat a linebacker in a foot race and really get to the second level, I think he can do it. So I think the tenacity that he runs with, the just get downhill and attack you mentality, I think he's going to find some success as long as he's healthy. It wouldn't surprise me if all the medical is clear with him, that a team would be willing to say, yeah, we take him in the 5th or even the 4th, maybe.
Well, yeah, Mark. So let's just dive into the wide receiver position group. For the casual fans out there who probably, get a lot of their information from Todd McShay and Mel Kiper, we're definitely going to hear about, the SEC receivers in Jamar Chase, Jalen Waddle, and Devontae Smith heading into the draft. But what wide receiver that you think could outshine all 3 of these SEC West, players?
I'm going to go very off the radar here, and I'm going to go with 2 if that's all right. One's a little bit more known because he went to the Senior Bowl, and he's picked up some steam down the stretch. Dwayne Eskridge from Western Michigan. I know he's gotten a lot more love lately, but you're talking about a guy who played corner in 2019, played receiver in 2020. So he's bounced around between those 2 positions. But I think when you see the type of athlete he is, and it shows even on his corner tape, because the click and close ability really flashed. His burst was something truly special to watch at corner. Well, you've got the same traits going into receiver. His acceleration, his ability to really get on top of guys and eat through cushion is really impressive. After the catch, he's got the burst to get away from you. He's agile enough to make you miss. I think there are a lot of athletic traits that can make this guy very special, where maybe he's not necessarily going to be a world beater, but I think he can be a very, very productive slot receiver at the next level. And then another one that I think is, and I think I might end up mentioning him later here with another one of these questions, because I very much love his tape, is Simi Fehoko from Stanford, who is, I'm excited to see his testing because I think he's going to be one of the true height, weight, speed freaks of this class. He's a redshirt sophomore who he technically would be a redshirt senior, but he took a 2-year mission prior to kind of playing ball at Stanford. So a little bit of an older guy, but he's like 6'3", 230-ish, somewhere in that ballpark. I think he's going to run low full fours. He kind of reminds me of Metcalf in a lot of ways. And I know that's a big comparison. That's a tall bar to clear. But I think in terms of his ability to threaten teams vertically, he's fluid in and out of his breaks. Some work to do technically, but I think from a potential standpoint, he's one of the most impressive guys in this class. So those are two I think could kind of outshine the top 3 group.
Gotcha. So another question I have for you that we've seen lately, of course, there's no NFL combine this year, right? So how much does the NFL miss having one centralized combine, and how legit are these, these numbers that's coming out from, these pro days that's happening on campus? I know we've seen something in the media just recently where Rashad Bateman and his 40, where his teammates were sticking up for him and saying, hey, he's that fast, and then you have the outsiders just like his play speed doesn't indicate the fact that he will run that type of 40. So what are your takes on that, Mark?
Yeah, and this is a great topic and one of my favorites because it was something that we had so many questions about going through this draft cycle. And I think with COVID kind of dying down a little bit here over the past few weeks, we've got to see some legit numbers come out, right? So for a while we thought, okay, no combine, all these training facilities like the House of Athletes and stuff like that, they're putting on these mock combines and they're sending the numbers out there, but you see a guy who's listed as running a 4.35 and you're like, yeah, I don't know about that. So you didn't know the validity of it because scouts couldn't go to these events that they had, this person who runs this and that, timed it, but it's not the same as having an area scout who goes in there and times it, but we've got to the point with pro days where teams are sending in GMs and all, they're sending everyone that they can. I think there are some schools that are limiting how many guys can kind of be in the building at the same time from an organization. So you can't send every scout you got out there to a pro day, but you can send your guys, right? You can go get official numbers. So I think the numbers that we're seeing on Twitter, some of them are a little bit iffy. The school puts out, this guy ran a 4.41. The area scout said he ran a 4.53. But if you know where you're looking, you can find the right numbers. You can find if it's legitimate, maybe give it that pro day bump of, a tenth of a second, give him that little notch up. But I think that the numbers that we're seeing, one, I'm very excited to see them, that we actually get pro days this year after not having them last year. But I think a lot of them are very legit. I think the biggest thing that's going to be tough for teams, especially, is not having the medicals, right? Because you're going to get some medicals if you got local like hospitals and stuff can check out the guys. Teams that are around the area can check them, and they're kind of gathering the information as a whole league rather than the individual teams doing it like they did in past years. I think that aspect of it, of the meetings and then the medicals, are the biggest thing that we're missing out on with the combine. And I'm very curious to see how that affects how teams kind of navigate moving guys off their board or that sort of thing. Of used to, it's like, your doctors say this guy's a no-go, he's off the board immediately as a medical reject. How many more medical rejects are we going to see just because we don't have full testing on these guys? It's going to be a very peculiar cycle, especially if teams are very hesitant to shoot on a guy that they don't have full medical on.
Interesting. So just like I mentioned before, Mark, I was out at the Senior Bowl, this year, and one guy that kind of stuck out to me was Sage Surratt, the wide receiver from Wake Forest. And one thing on his one-on-ones, during the practice week, it really looked like he was having trouble, with the bump and run coverage, getting off, press man. Did you see that on his film, or do you think that was something that he will struggle with on the next level?
Yeah, I saw with this film, and I always worry about those guys who are a little bit bigger, who aren't as easy of separators, because at that point you're just saying, hey, this he is what he is. He's, 6'3", 215 or whatever, but he's going to be a pure contested catch guy. Well, if you don't have great hands and if you don't have great contested catch ability, can you be trusted to do that? So with Surratt, I think just based on what I saw, he's not a great separator. He's not the type of technician who's going to really wow you with his routes and really deceive defensive backs. I don't think they're going to fear him enough athletically to really not be afraid to get up on top of him and really pressure him and press him. So I do think there are going to be some issues with him in terms of just consistently creating separation. So I think some of the concerns that you have are warranted regarding his game.
So just going back to the NFL Draft Bible, you guys got Rondale Moore as the second best receiver behind Jalen Waddle, a slot receiver, let me mention that, and a projected first rounder. Of course, we know he has obvious talent, but with his injury history and opt-out through the halfway of this particular season, do you see that being a concern of him actually keeping him from landing in the first round?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's enough to have a significant injury in your past, and then you've got the opt out. And then again, like I mentioned with combines, right? You're not going to feel as comfortable with the guy where you don't have, he's had severe injuries. Maybe you don't have the medical that you want on the guy where you can send in your doctors, your trainers to really get their hands on him and get an idea of what's up with this guy. So if you don't feel comfortable with that because he has the injury history, because you couldn't get guys in there on him, a lot of teams are going to be a lot more nervous about taking that round one, because that's a huge investment to put into a guy, spending that round one pick on someone that you aren't sure where he stands medically, right? So I think all of those things together are probably going to push him out of the first round if that were my guess. But all it takes is one. If one team says, hey, our doctors cleared him and we really love his tape and we're going to buy on that, even though we have a limited sample size, all it takes is one. But I think generally teams are going to be a little bit more hesitant to take a shot on that in round one.
So just staying with the slot position from the receiver group, we've seen one guy that kind of really boosted his stock tremendously this year. Just having a great season, having a great Senior Bowl week. He didn't play in the Senior Bowl game, but it really seemed like he didn't need to because he just had a dominant week. And that player is Kadarius Toney out of Florida. So if Rondale Moore, slides out of that first round, is there an instance where a team, kind of put Kadarius Toney in that position over Rondale Moore because of, he has a lot of more film than Rondale Moore, and we've seen the talent and we saw what he did this season along with what he did at the Senior Bowl.
Yeah, I will say before I get into this, I haven't finalized my report on Toney. I've seen bits and pieces here and there, but I haven't been able to write him up. So my opinion on him isn't firm yet, but I'll say this is I don't think Toney having more tape would necessarily boost him up over Rondale. More so as much as like Rondale not having as much tape kind of drops him for teams, and the medical would drop him, right? So if you think Rondale, just based on what you saw, is a better player, then you would have him higher, but then you'd factor in the other things and that would push him down. It's not necessarily going to push Toney up as much as it's pushing Rondale down. So if a team goes into it thinking Toney's a round two guy and that sort of thing, just because you have another guy who has a lot of similarities fall, it doesn't mean you're going to move him up necessarily. If that's what you're getting at all. Maybe I'm misinterpreting that.
No, you're spot on with that. That's pretty much what I was hitting at. But once again, I would like to wrap up the wide receiver position group and just throw out my sleeper for this position group, which I think is Cornell Powell out of Clemson. Justin Ross, he was that guy, but of course he had that injury. Could it be career threatening? I know he's still trying to work his way back, but with that injury, Cornell Powell kind of stepped into that role and kind of actually made a name for himself. So out of the receiver groups that's getting drafted this year, like who are some of your sleepers that you project to be out there?
Well, first off, I just want to say it's crazy what Clemson does because they're a factory. Like, you don't hear anything about Cornell Powell at all. He had no career starts pretty much coming into the year. There's really nothing on the guy out there. And then, we guess he's just taking over the starting role now because they lost Justin Ross. They're limited with some of the other guys they have. So throw him out there. And he goes out there and has a dominant year and goes crazy. Now we're talking about him as a mid-round pick. So it's crazy what Clemson does from a receiver producing standpoint. But one guy out there out here that I don't think gets nearly enough attention is Tyler Vaughn from USC, right? So he's a 3-year starter at USC. He's got great body control against the boundary. Some of the catches he makes is just phenomenal. He's a good route runner. He's got a little bit of a thin frame, a little bit slight, but I don't think it's enough to where it's a deterrent to his game. I think good after the catch. Like I said, runs nice routes. So there's a lot of things to love with Tyler Vaughn's, and I'm surprised he hasn't gotten a lot more love. I see a lot of people saying he's going to be a late round pick, maybe a UDFA. In this class, I would be stunned if Tyler Vaughn's doesn't at least go in the 6th. Like, he's at that point, maybe there's medical or something that I'm not aware of that's dropping him. But his tape is that of a guy who's, in my opinion, going to be at least, I would say, a valuable wide receiver at minimum. And I think he can be more than that too. So that's my guy, Tyler Vaughn's.
Rob, I know you like Tyler Vaughns.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, not only do I like Tyler Vaughns, but I like his running mate, Armon St. Brown as well. I really, that USC receiver class over the last couple of years has been really, really good. So, I mean, we've kind of seen Michael Pittman. I know he was banged up early in the year, but late in the year, he kind of got into his own. And he was coming along. So I really like Tyler Vaughns and Armon St. Brown.
Yeah, Rob was big on those USC guys heading into the season, man. He's been talking about those guys for a few months now. Let's go to the tight end. Let's shift over to the tight end. And I want to know, how big is the gap between Kyle Pitts and the field? Because there's some good tight ends in this class. And I know I have my Florida Gator hat on, which is probably a poor choice for this question. But Kyle Pitts versus the field, how big is the gap, Mark?
I'll add this. I haven't finalized my report on Pitts, so I don't want to say it's like something, absurd. But from what I have seen of Pitts, I think athletically what he brings is really special compared to the other tight ends. I think you look at guys like Hunter Long. Like Hunter Long's a very solid tight end. Brevin Jordan's a very solid tight end. They're good athletes, right? They're good receivers. But Pitts you could legitimately kick him out there and start him at wide receiver. Like you can use him as an outside receiver and he'd be fine. And he's, 6'6", 240 and it's going to run 4.6 something, and Trask is just throwing it up to him. I think if you're talking about what they can be upside wise, I think the gap between Pitts and the other guys, at least from what I've seen, is pretty notable. Again, I don't want to say, oh yeah, Pitts is guaranteed this and that, because I haven't put in the report yet. But I think the gap based on what I've seen so far is pretty notable.
I'll go ahead and say Pitts is guaranteed this and that. I'll do that for you. I'll make that stamp. He was insane. I've never seen a playmaker like him. He's a very unique set of abilities at the college level for sure. And if he gets, obviously with the NFL, it's all about kind of who you get with in the right scheme and everything too. So what other rookie tight ends in this class do you think can make an immediate impact, assuming, of course, you go into the right system?
Mm-hmm. It's tough because this is, I want to say, a historically weak tight end class, because we've had so many guys who are like late round picks prior to UDFAs that have just said, oh, I'm going back to school. So we've lost 20, 30 tight ends that would normally be late rounders who are like, oh, maybe this guy's interesting. Maybe we pick him up as a prior to UDFA and he becomes a tight end too or something. So one guy that I do like though is Pro Wells from TCU. I think he's probably going to go late. He's a good high weight speed guy. I like him when you get the ball in his hands. He's got a good stride, able to pick up speed nicely over space. So I think he's an interesting one from a developmental standpoint. I wish there was more consistency as a blocker, but if I'm picking late round guys and just hoping I hit something, I'm going to lean Pro Wells.
You're seeing that. I know you talked about your spreadsheet earlier, moving 30 plus quarterbacks back over. Are we seeing that across a lot? Is this a thinner class in general, would you say, across the board?
I lost track of how many guys I moved over, to be completely honest. I think I lost count around 550. I have over 60 linebackers that I kicked over to 2022. So, and a lot of these guys are lower end guys. They're not guys that are going to be viewed as, future starters. They might just be camp bodies or tryouts.
But guys who would have been drafted though, like Jake Hansen out of Illinois, maybe.
Oh yeah, it's a fair one.
Like
yeah,
yeah. Like some of these guys would legit be drafted this year if they come out.
I would say we've seen probably about 60 guys who probably would have been in the draftable mix that went back. A lot of the guys are just tryout camp guy level guys, but like just looking at my tight ends right here, right? Like I'll just tell you how many guys I have on my tight end list. Now I stopped updating it because I started to work on 2022 database stuff. So I just started saying, I'm just going to start from scratch and ignore all the guys that I moved out of the past class. But just at the guys that I got to, I had over 30 guys at tight end that I moved over to the next class. And not a bunch of big name guys, but like Nick News from South Carolina, Shrine Bowl invite, probably would have been a late rounder. Chase Allen from Iowa State probably would have been a late rounder.
Yeah,
there are guys that probably would have been taken late in the draft or been prior to UDFAs that so many of them went back. And like I said, it got up to the point where it was like I lost track because there's hundreds and hundreds of guys that went back, and we're still finding out new guys every day that you get to pro days and hey, this guy didn't test. Why isn't he testing? Oh, he went back to school. Like it is just. You look at a team like Nevada. Nevada had, I think, 8 guys that I watched, and 7 of them went back. It's absurd.
Mark, we did the highlights for the Shrine Bowl on Twitter. Like we're putting together highlight clips for the guys, and I can't tell you how many clips we'd make and be like, nope, that guy went back to school. It was like that.
So we definitely feel your pain on that
Feel
one.
your pain.
Yeah.
Feel your pain on that. But for college football perspective, certainly a lot of experience coming back next season. That should make for some interesting teams next year. So, Mark, we've seen the offensive line. We've seen obviously the league shift toward more of a spread game, more of a spread out, and especially I feel like it's really accelerated like gas on fire the last couple of years here. But we're seeing more of a spread out game. Are you shifting your offensive line evaluations? Maybe taller, faster guys, or not taller? I'm sorry, like leaner, quicker guys. Or
Yeah.
Are you shifting in general, or is it not that significant?
It's going to depend so much because you're going to have some teams that are kind of prioritizing that's what they're looking for, right? But you're going to have other teams that are still that smash mouth, get a powerful guy, get a guy who's real physical and is more of the mauler, right? So it's going to depend so much on what each team looks for. Obviously, you see that general shift. A lot more teams are leaning into that tall, lean, fast guy, right? But it's not like it's a runaway thing where every team's doing that, right? There's still a mix. So projecting is a little bit more friendly towards those athletes, in my opinion now. But if you're thinking about it, how does this guy fit for a certain team? You still got to consider, okay, maybe he's not going to be a fit for a zone team that wants him to reach block all the time, but maybe he's a sufficient mauler. Maybe he's good at sealing the backside, right? So, there's give and take to it. I think in general you do see the shift, but there's still room for the big hog mollies.
So one guy that was really in everybody's top 3 I saw last year around this time in the 2020 the look ahead drafts, Penei Sewell out of Oregon. He chose to opt out of 2020, and we've heard some GMs. I think Rob was at Pittsburgh that flat out came out and said if you sat out in 2020, like that's a knock on you in our book. Like we've heard some GMs flat out say that. How much momentum did a guy like Penei Sewell lose by choosing to opt out in 2020? Obviously, the guy's still going to be a first-round pick. Might have only hurt him by a few picks here, so definitely being a little dramatic in the phrase of the question. But, I mean, for other guys, it maybe could cost them a round or two, right?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because when you look at the top-end guys, it doesn't hurt him as much with like a Sewell. Like Sewell's a freak athlete. If you take his tape and just what he did when he was a sophomore, right? Like you just take that and say, yeah, that's a top 10 player. You don't really have to worry about, oh, well, we didn't see him again this year. What's the development? Well, he didn't need to develop that much. What we saw was a top 5 player on film or top 10 player on film, however you want to cut that. But you get my point. He is what he is at that point. Like, this is a top guy.
Right.
Whereas you look at maybe some later round picks who they might have only been, oh, this guy might be a 5th or a 6th, and then they sit out. Well, maybe you expected them to take a leap and they didn't. This guy didn't sit out, but here's an example. Jason Away for Penn State. And a lot of people say, oh, well, he's a great athlete. There's so much to work with. But, okay, had he sat out, maybe that would have hurt him a lot. I think Greg Rousseau, to an extent, has suffered from this because Greg Rousseau, we saw, he's obviously got great length. He's 6'6", 6'7", 260. He's a big, long guy. He had some great flashes of power. But he was super productive. But then you said, okay, well, he wasn't always consistent with his hand usage. You wanted to see more in terms of winning off the edge. A lot of his production came from when he was lined up inside. So we wanted to see more complete work from Greg Rousseau, and then he sits out. So the projection gets a little bit murkier for a guy like that who isn't that kind of slam dunk Penei Sewell, Micah Parsons type of player, in my opinion. So those are the guys that get hurt by sitting out, not necessarily the top 5, the top 10 guy. It's the guy who he needed to show us more and he didn't.
This job's not hard enough, and then you got to throw 2020 on top of it, man. This is so many factors to consider with last year. But a little more of a college football question, and I know you're an NFL draft guy, but 2 5-star prospects here we're going to ask you about. Alex Leatherwood out of Alabama, Walker Little out of Stanford. Never quite lived up to that 5-star billing in college. Walker Little had some injury issues, but do you factor that in at all? Like, I mean, because I guess you would look at guys like that, and like the fans who follow recruiting and sit there might look at those guys as a little disappointing, just a bit disappointing among their own fan bases. Do the scouts, they only care about the tape, right? Like, how do they do, or do they even, is there some factor on the mental side of like, hey, this guy had a lot of expectations and he didn't live up to that? Maybe that's a little bit of a red flag as far as maybe reaching on him in the draft or something like that. Or am I getting way too in the weeds on that?
I think it's a fantastic topic. It's one I've talked about with a few people of, when you look at recruiting status, it seems to be that these guys who are former 5-star, 4-star recruits get a little bit more time to figure it out. Like, oh, he was a great athlete in high school and he was a top recruit. Maybe this guy it hasn't clicked yet, but something's there to be worked with. And so you see hype on some of these guys way past where the hype should go. I used to think it might be an interesting thing to study and care about, but the more I get into it, the more I think, you don't want to base your evaluation all based on what someone said about a guy back in high school, right? Like you don't want to say, oh, well, someone else who, the 247 sports guy, no knock on them. I, nothing but respect to them, but they're seeing this guy completely different than an NFL draft evaluator is going to see him, right? Like it's a whole different thing, projecting a guy from high school to college and then from college to the NFL. And I don't want to base my opinion on a guy meeting or failing to meet expectations based off of what somebody else's expectations were for him, right? Like you don't want to put that on this guy of maybe he's a 5-star. Well, if he's just an average player and maybe he's going to be a backup in the league, you don't say, well, he was a 5-star and he's a backup. You don't want to ever have the expectations going into what you're going to see on a guy. So I think it's an interesting in conversation to have, certainly, but it's one that kind of like you said, the scouts are going to rely on the tape. If the guy plays like a 5-star and in terms of like he's a dominant player, he's everything he was built as, cool. If he's a 5-star who just never did anything and is just not impressive, well, it is what it is at that point. He is what he is.
And sometimes those 5-star kids are 5-star kids in high school because they're a 5-star at that moment too, and they might not develop to that level too. So I know a lot goes into that, but that was just something Rob and I were talking about. That's a great analysis on that though, Mark.
Well, let me see. I'm going to pull him up real quick if that's all right. And I think there's a guy in mind that I think is a great example of that. Cause like you said, there's guys that are those high school stars where
right.
I think at the moment it's justified, like the recruiting analysts who grade them very highly and think they're going to be immediate producers. They have very valid reasons to. Here's one in mind, right? Benito Jones at Ole Miss, I think was a great example of that because he's a smaller guy. He's only about 6 foot, 305, 310 in that range. He was a very good high school recruit. He was great with his hands. He was explosive for his size, right? For a high school guy. But when you project his growth potential and how he's going to turn into an NFL guy, it gets a little bit muddier because, he doesn't have great length. And maybe some of that explosiveness that we saw in high school isn't going to translate as easily to what he's going to be asked to do with the NFL level. And so Benito Jones kind of went from, he's a standout, he's going to be this top guy. And he was in high school to, he's a solid starter for a SEC team. He's a very good player, college player. But then you get into, he's probably more of a depth guy at the NFL level, which is all right. There's nothing wrong with that. But that's why you see these guys who come out of high school who they're, 6'5", 180. And then next thing you know, 3 years from now, they're 6'6", 260, and they're freak of nature edge rushers who come out of nowhere. Like, what happened with this dude? Well, he was a wide receiver size in high school, and now he's a prototype defensive end. So there's so much that can change in that time. So
I think you're just explaining how a lot of coaches miss on recruits too at the college level. You just crack that mystery open for a lot of college football fans too.
I got a lot of work to do in that before I ever want to put out opinions on all the how to recruit properly. But if the colleges ever come calling, I'll be open to it. I'll get involved with that.
Hey man, it's starting to get pretty deep on those departments. You might get that call sometime.
It's exciting. Soon. It's so exciting to see that. I see
like
every day.
Full on scouting departments, man.
Yeah, every day I'm seeing. This person just got a shot as director of player personnel for a school, and it's like, man, they're actually making them departments. Used to it was just, hey, let's just go off the recruiting and maybe the coaches like this guy on a visit and like his body type and that sort of stuff. And watch a couple of highlights and this guy really flashes and you bring him in. But now you've got full on scouting departments for some
transfer portal. You got to keep an eye on so much. You got to keep an eye on it.
Like Texas State, I think they didn't have a single incoming freshman. It was all transfer portal stuff. So you've got Texas State's staff figuring out, okay, let's bring this guy over who's a graduate transfer from Utah State, who's a 1-year starter. Well, maybe he comes in and he's the answer. So there's so many moving pieces there, and there's so many exciting things. And ultimately, I think in a lot of ways, whether it's stuff like the CFL and XFL, the arena leagues, smaller leagues popping up, or for these schools, opportunities for people analyzing the game and analyzing these players coming out of high school. It's just nice to see scouts get jobs, right? Like just see guys that know how to evaluate talent, finding opportunities, getting their foot in the door and being able to improve whether it's a college team or an NFL team or an arena league team. it's cool to see guys get the opportunities.
Well, in fairness to Texas State too, not a lot of high school football in the state of Texas. So I'm not well versed in the high school football, but I don't think there's a lot. No, but we actually did a story on that in the podcast a few episodes back, a few weeks ago, and their big thing was they want to put eyeballs on these guys. And they didn't get to do that a lot this year. They weren't like able to get to like a lot of these games and everything. So it's like they wanted more live action, and they could still. They're like, we're not done necessarily. Like we can offer guys over the summer and stuff. So really interesting tack though. But I love this conversation. Keep this going forever. But we got to get rolling here. Landon Dickerson, Alabama. I think FSU was another transfer there. We're talking about there. Great season. Unfortunately, gets the ACL in the SEC title game. You think a guy like that who's a clear talent, I think would probably be a clear first round pick if he's totally healthy. How much of that the NFL teams? We talked about that immediate impact right away. You're gambling away this year basically with a guy like that. I'm guessing like how many teams are going to drop him for the injury?
Yeah, it's tough. I would want, again, this all goes back to the whole combine thing being a mess because we don't know, is it something that's still having issues with healing? Is it something that he's ahead of schedule? We don't know where he's at. And until we know where he's at, you can't really say, yeah, we feel comfortable with him or not. So if you're a team and you think he's ahead of schedule and you feel good about what people were saying about him, then you say, yeah, we think he's going to be ready by the start of next year. We think he's going to be fully healed. Let's bring him in and spend this, first round pick on him. But if you have any questions about it, you're hesitant. It was an ACL, correct? I haven't studied Dickerson in depth yet. So was it an ACL or something else?
Oh, I thought it was ACL, Rob.
Yep, it was ACL.
Okay. Yeah, and it seems like ACL has been something that it's been a lot more friendly for guys to come back from it. Like now it's the Achilles is the real scary thing because you lose so much of your explosiveness and all that. ACL, they've got the witchcraft going on back there with the doctors giving a surgically repaired ACL, and next thing you know, the guy's back in 5 months and ready to go, fully healed and better than ever. So I think the ACL is probably going to scare teams less than if it had been Achilles. Like Dayo Odeyingbo from Vanderbilt hurt his Achilles, and he's probably going to fall quite a bit because of that. But an ACL, better odds, I think, is still being a first-round pick.
Who's sleeper offensive lineman?
Oh, man, that's a really tough one. If you don't mind, I'm going to consult the spreadsheet real quick because there's –
Go for it, man. Cheating is allowed.
Cheating is allowed. Awesome. Yeah, that's one thing I will say is I've been on a few things where people are like, oh, name a sleeper at this or that. And I'm like, I don't just have them buried off the top of my head. I've watched however many guys, and I've got a long list of, well, this guy might be a backup, but this guy might be a fringe starter.
I figured you'd be mumbling these names in your sleep at this point of the year.
This is the thing, right? Is if you tell me pick a guy, I get brain freeze, and I'm like, oh gosh, there's so many options. But you say, Mark, tell me about Fresno State's guys, and I can sit there and let me tell you about all the guys I watched at Fresno State. So
it's like someone saying, tell me a joke.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But one I'll go with here, and a guy that I don't think gets enough buzz is Dan Moore Jr. from Texas A&M, right? So a lot of talented guys on that A&M line, but I think he's probably the most talented, at least of guys that are going to be in this class. Maybe Kenyon Green for next year is better, but I think what Moore brings is he's a 3-year starter at left tackle in the SEC, right? He's got good hands. He's got a good body type. I think he's more built like a guard than a tackle. His length's acceptable for a tackle, but it's not something that you're like, okay, yeah, I feel really comfortable with this guy controlling the distance and really setting the tone and pass protection. But I think he's a smart blocker. He's patient with his hands. His angles are pretty solid. I think he has a sufficient anchor. I worry about if you do stick him out at tackle, how's he going to deal with the guys who are really explosive and bendy? But I think if you kicked him into guard, he's going to be just fine in that regard. I'd like to see a little bit more in terms of just what's the right word here, power to drive guys out of the lane and really open things up in the run game. I think he can improve in that regard in terms of just straight up power. But I think in terms of the rest of the traits, all there. My thing is when you look at the guys that are more the sleeper tackles and the sleeper guards in this class, right? You got to find the guys who have the versatility, because if you're talking about a guy who's going to go in the 5th, 6th round, we're not talking about a future starter, probably, at least not an early career starter. We're talking about a guy who he's got to provide value as that 6th, 7th lineman that you're going to put on the 53 man. Well, if you get a guy who can be both a tackle and a guard and fill multiple positions for you, if someone goes down, Dan Moore Jr. is ready to come in like that. And it could be a tackle, it could be a guard, it doesn't matter. You just plug him in, he'll survive, right? So I think Moore is probably going to be a guy that we see go in that 5th to 6th range. I think Jim Nagy's a little bit higher. I think he thinks he's going to go in the 4th. But
he's a Senior Bowl guy, right?
Yeah, he's a Senior Bowl guy.
I thought he was. Yeah, I recognize that name from the Senior Bowl. Just quick correction. I was just Googling the knee injury for our boy Dickerson. I didn't see ACL. I was saying ligament damage. Rob and I were saying ACL. So I'm not totally sure. A little murky on that right now. So don't take our word for that right this second. Hey Rob, let's kick it over the D line. Let's get the D line going.
Yeah, so let's stay in the trenches, Mark. So from the defensive line position standpoint, we know Aaron Donald is that gold standard. And I'm not saying it's a lot of Aaron Donalds out there hanging off trees, but how does the Aaron Donald, affect? How does that the Aaron Donald gold standard, how does that help or hurt the draft process when it comes to evaluating defensive tackles? Just like I said, it's not a lot of Aaron Donalds out there, but it really seems like, every year that team is trying to get that Aaron Donald caliber type of player.
Yeah, I think I'll pull out two names here, right? So first, I'm going to go back to Ed Oliver. I think Ed Oliver going as high as he did was because of what we saw with Aaron Donald. I think the Bills felt comfortable saying this can be that type of game wrecker, right? Like a guy who maybe we don't trust him to sit down and hold a spot and run defense, but he's so explosive and he's so good at penetrating that he's just going to kill run lanes and he's going to be in the backfield instantly, right? So I think that kind of made teams a little bit more comfortable with those outliers, guys who maybe he's only 6'1.5" and he's only 280 pounds, but he's so explosive and he's so much of a game wrecker in the pass game or even in the run game when he gets penetration to where we can say, yeah, we can bet on this guy. I think the results with Oliver have been a little bit mixed, obviously, but that's the thought is you get a guy who can be that type of athlete who can transcend in a lot of ways what the traditional mold is at defensive tackle. I think in this class, we had a guy who got a little bit of that love early on. Maybe it was just the fact he's coming out of Pitt, but Jalen Twyman ended up opting out. And I think he's an example of a guy who hurt himself by opting out because we saw some of that round 1 buzz from the media early on, but it seems more like Twyman's going to be that 4th, 5th round type of guy because, he's, for his size, he's pretty explosive. He has some flashes with his hands, but it wasn't like a freakish Aaron Donald, Ed Oliver level of athlete. We're talking about a guy who's a good athlete who has some great flashes of pass rusher, but he's not on that level. And if you're going to transcend that and be like an Aaron Donald, you've got to be a truly, truly special athlete. There are very few in this class that are that type of athlete. And I don't think there's any at D tackle. I think if you kicked it over like Kyle Pitts is that type of athlete, right? Like a Jalen Waddle with his explosiveness and burst is that type of athlete. Micah Parsons is that type of athlete. There aren't many of those guys. So you might only get one of those at D tackle every few years. And we really don't have one this year. So I would say Donald doesn't have as much of an effect in terms of this year's draft class. Got you.
So we spoke about this before in regards to, the NFL kind of opening it up, taking that, college style offense spread style and bringing it to the NFL. With that being said, how does that affect the zero technique nose guard as far as the draft process? I know we saw Vita Vea, in the Super Bowl have a huge impact, not necessarily, racking up sacks or tackles, but kind of freeing those guys on the outside and Shaq Barrett and JPP. So how do you feel like the traditional nose guard zero technique is going to take a hit in the draft process moving forward?
It's tough because you bring up Vita Vea, but I think Vita Vea isn't that special athlete tier that I mentioned with those guys just now. So I think he's a little bit of an anomaly in that regard. So comparing a lot of nose tackles and nose guards to him is tough. But I think it's a very interesting conversation, right? Because when you're projecting these guys from the college levels to the NFL, it's so tough because the demand is a lot smaller than it used to be, right? Like you might only have a few teams that are really looking for this is what we want. A lot of teams might say, yeah, we just, we can plug this guy in the back of the roster and we got one guy for this role. Or some teams might not even say, let's have anyone for this role. So the demand is certainly a lot lower. I think there's also a lower supply. I think college football is putting out a lot less of these just typical, plug a spot type guys like that. But I know where we're going with this with a guy that you're excited to talk about. And I'm excited too because he's a really interesting player. But I'll throw it to a guy who actually went back for this next season, which he initially I thought was going to come out. He got a CGS invite and all that, but ended up turning it down. Tyrese Stevenson from Tulsa, who's about 6'1", 350, big dude, right? And so there's not much that he does from an athletic standpoint that's really impressive. Like his hands are anything out of the ordinary. He doesn't have great length, so he's not going to wire you in terms of tackle radius. So when he's fighting through blocks, he's not really getting extension, locking onto guys from range. But and he doesn't bring much as a passer, right? So he would be at most a 20% rep guy for a full game. Like he's not going to get a lot of reps. He's a very low rotation guy, but he's not movable. If you really want to lock down that spot on the interior and just really hold the center in spot or hold a guard spot, you're not moving this guy. So that's what's special about those guys. You find those guys who they have that anchor, and that's a lot of times all it takes to be a fringe guy who maybe he's on the practice squad or maybe he's the back of the roster as a nose tackle, but maybe he's getting 10, 15, 20% of the snaps in a game, but he's playing, right? He's getting opportunities because he does have that one thing that makes him stick, which is the anchor. So I think there's certainly a value for it. You've just got to find the right guys, and I think there aren't as many as college football right now, but there's still certainly those types of dudes out there.
And then that's a great segue to bring up the guy that we actually had on as a guest, and Jordan Scott out of Oregon. He's that traditional, nose guard playing that zero technique. And just like you said, Mark, he's one of those guys that's hard to move, that has that anchor, that's going to get that penetration. But one thing that he brought up to us is that, later on in his career, he actually developed those pass rushing moves. So he did kind of, move from that zero technique to the 3 technique where, he can stop the run and also rush the passer as well. So, but one thing with Jordan is that, he has that great play strength, but, his height is that one thing that, a lot of these teams are looking for, if they're going to have that one player on the team to kind of be that anchor or be that guy like a Linval Joseph. Does height and weight play a factor in that, or they're just,
I think it's interesting because I'll be upfront with you. I don't know what all a coaching staff's going to want in a lot of ways, because each coaching staff's going to want different things from their nose tackle, right? Like me personally, I love the guys who have the length, right? Because then if you're engaged with the blocker, when you go to shed, you have the length to where you can extend and get a hand out and really, get your hands on a guy and finish the tackle. Whereas a guy who's got a very small wingspan, who's shorter, generally going to have the smaller arms and doesn't have as much range, just from a body type standpoint, is going to have a harder time really getting out there. So they're going to have to offset that with agility and being quick to react, right? So it's going to depend on what the team wants from that position. It's going to depend on, does this coaching staff want a guy who's going to be that 6-foot guy who's only 310 or whatever, but he can really move side to side, like a Scott, for instance, who's a guy who has the lateral agility that you really don't typically see for a guy who's more of a pure nose tackle, right? Like he can move a little bit. So it's tough because some teams are probably going to want that more, and some teams are going to want the big guy who's got the length. But I think there's certainly a role for that, though, even with the smaller guys they don't have the typical height, they don't have the typical length. As long as you're finding your way to the ball and being effective in run defense, I think there's still a home for you. It's just a matter of, do teams find that one trait that makes you stick, right? When you're talking about those guys who are those later round UDFA types who get onto the roster and stick on the 53, it's because they have that one trait that says, okay, this is what we can use him for. And that's what allows them to get on. So I think with Scott, you're talking about a guy who, with his hand usage and with his agility, he has that to stick. Even if it's not the typical, let me just anchor down and hold the spot and then shed, it's more of a reactive. He still has enough to work with.
Yeah. Well, maybe you can help us in our audience with this mystery, Mark. So I just want to dive into Marvin Wilson. At this time around last year, he was, kind of projected a top 10, top 15 guy. Now it just seems like he kind of fell off the map. So could you dive into the details in regards to Marvin Wilson in the draft process? Once again, he was a Senior Bowl guy. I got to see him up close and personal. He kind of got nicked up and banged up out there at the Senior Bowl. So he didn't go through a lot of the practice agility drills and everything, for the most of the week. But could you just talk about, his slide down the draft process so far?
Yeah, it's tough because for me, at least, I don't think he's a guy who should be falling as far as he is. I think his hand usage is really impressive. He's very refined with it. He's active with his counters. I think in terms of power that he generates with his rush is solid. But I guess the thing with him is just people don't see the type of athlete necessarily. Like he's a little bit more of a slow-footed guy who's going to win with his upper body more than his lower body. So it's going to be a little bit tougher for him to get penetration to really threaten offensive linemen side to side. And I think that's where a lot of the concerns come from, because when you look at a guy like Levi Onwuzurike, who's getting a lot of buzz as a possible, maybe an early second round type of guy, or Jay Tufele, if you just go down the board, you're going to find a lot of these guys at the defensive tackle position who are great athletes, who are guys that can move very well laterally and can penetrate a little bit easier than Wilson is. I still think Wilson, if you get him in the 4th round, you're getting a good value. You're getting a starting 3 tech, in my opinion. And I think he's going to be a guy that ends up, people are knocking him a little bit too much more than they should, because what he brings as a baseline is very impressive.
Got you. And before I let you go off the defensive line hot seat, I just want to dive into Isaiah Loudermilk. Just dropping nearly 20 pounds from his roster to his pro day weigh-in. Do you often see this weight shift, from the roster weigh-ins to the pro days and the combine workouts?
This is one of my favorite questions you've asked so far, because that was a really surprising one to me, right? So, I thought Loudermilk was a guy who'd add weight. I thought he'd try to get up to 305 and say, yeah, I'm going to be, a typical 3-4 defensive end, and I'm a run defender through and through. And then he drops 20 pounds. You go, are you sure about that, man? Are you are you going to be like a 4-3 DN, and you're going to be a really explosive, bendy guy on the outside? So, I wonder what the thought process there. We saw it last year with Jason Strobridge adding weight. So you do see some of that. Guys will drop weight or add weight and see, what do I think benefits me the most in terms of how I project the teams. Maybe it's what their agents are telling them. Hey, teams want to see you drop weight and play this role more. Why don't you do that and try to do that at the pro day? There's so much in play there. It's certainly not something you see a lot, right? You don't see at every single team's pro day. You don't see 3 guys drop 20 pounds. It's not common. It's pretty rare that you see a guy change their body type significantly from what they were in college. But it certainly does happen. You're going to catch a few, and I'll keep trying to hunt them down when they happen. But you're going to see guys drop 15, 20 pounds here and there, add 15, 20 pounds there. So you're going to see it. But I think Loudermilk was certainly one of the most interesting ones in that regard, because like I said, body type wise, I thought he'd want to add weight, not drop it. So to see him drop that weight and then go out and he had a solid pro day performance, but I would have loved to see how he moved around at 275, because that's a very key part of the evaluation if you're a team projecting him as more of a traditional 4-3 guy than a 3-4 guy. So.
Yeah, I think you're spot on in that regards, Mark, because just like you said, I thought he would add weight just watching his film and breaking him down for the East-West Shrine game. He's not that, explosive athlete on the outside where he's going to bend around the corner and cause havoc, to the quarterbacks. So I thought he would add weight and kind of be that, that run stuffer up the middle, so forth. But and another interesting thing that I saw, I know Devontae Smith, the biggest thing about him is, his weight and his playing weight and everything. So out at the Senior Bowl, he didn't actually weigh in or anything like that. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Have you ever seen something like that before? I've never seen anything like that. I've seen players, not run the 40, not, take part in the bench and vertical. But as far as weighing in, that was a first for me. And I'm kind of new at this, but that was definitely a first for me.
Yeah, and one thing before we get onto this, I just want to throw out, you mentioned Loudermilk and you watching him as a Shrine guy, right? And I just want to say, that's one thing I'd really want to harp on is, how important it is for these scouts when they go out and see these guys at the pro days. And that's what makes it so helpful is you go and see a guy at 270. Loudermilk's going to be a completely different player from what you saw him, what I saw him on tape, to what he'd be at 275 pounds, right? So that's key for these guys getting out there these pro days. But going to the point on Devonta Smith, I don't recall seeing it, right? So, I think he measured in height and arm length and all. He did all the measurements. They just he didn't weigh in, right? Am I wrong on that? He got all the other measurements?
Yeah. He just didn't do the weigh in.
Guys, I got 2 eyes. It's $165. Put it down.
I think so. I think that was the fear.
And I tell you what, Mark, I think, one of the takeaways that, I kind of took away from the Senior Bowl is just actually seeing these guys up close and personal. And I think, with the whole scouting capacity, not having a full staff to come out to games, to the pro days and Senior Bowls or whatnot, I think it was beneficial to see that, because just seeing his frame is just of course you watch him on TV, you can see that he has a slender frame, but to see it in person, I was taken back. I was like, oh my God, he looks smaller in person than he does on on TV. So I thought that was an interesting takeaway. Not only with him, same thing with Ian Book. I thought Ian Book was a little bit taller, but just seeing him in person, I was like, wow, like, okay, Ian Book is not that tall. And then same thing with we talked about the quarterback position in Ellinger. So he was a little bit more, husky, a little bit more built. And I was just like, oh, I wasn't expecting that. But so that, I think that's one takeaway, just throughout the whole process that you kind of have to harp on, just seeing these guys, up close and personal, off film, and just seeing them, face to face. So I thought that was really, really good takeaway for me being out at the Senior Bowl.
If you don't mind me, I was going to add to that. I think that's something that doesn't get talked about enough is when the scouts value that so much, getting to get up close and personal with the guy, because there are players that you're going to see in person that they're different than when you see them on tape, right? Like you can look on tape and say, okay, that guy's got really long arms, or, oh, he's got a nice body type. But, until you actually get there and see it in person, there are certain players that stand out, right? So like, I think if there are two guys that I noticed, I didn't go to this past Senior Bowl, but I went to the one in 2020. And the two guys that stood out to me were Robert Hunt from Louisiana Lafayette and Lecky Fotu from Utah. And I remember very vividly walking through. First, I saw Fotu at the airport, and he was just a giant. He was all over the other guys. Like Evan Weaver standing beside him and looks like a child next to the dad. Like it was But then I was walking through the hotel, and did you go into the hotel at all? I know they had it a little bit closed up.
Yeah, for this year it was for COVID reasons they had it closed off, so I didn't get a chance to go in the hotel. But just practices and everything, just seeing those guys up close and personal was definitely a sight to see.
So I walked into the second floor of that hotel, and Lecky Fotu's sitting over there in full size, like just normal chair. And it's a chair that I'm a pretty decently sized man myself. I would sit in and be pretty comfy. I'd have room to maneuver in there, right? And he's sitting there talking to a scout, and the scout's sitting, he looks like a regular old dude sitting in the chair, and Fotu's sitting in a chair. Those little tyke seats you see at Thanksgiving for the kids? He looked like an adult sitting on one of those. Like he filled up the whole thing. So when you get to see the guys in person, it's a whole different experience. Because like you said with Devonta Smith, right? You look at him and you see him on TV, and like, yeah, he's got very small limbs, but when you really see him in person, you go, man, I got bigger calves than him. Like, yeah. And it surprises you. So when you get to really get up close and personal, you understand how much the body type matters. And that's something that I think so many people get lost on in the scouting aspect for the media and just independent. When you really get into like what scouts really care about, so much of it is the body type, because there are certain body types that just don't play in the league. You don't find a receiver who typically is 165 pounds who has limbs like that, where he can't add weight. You don't see that playing in the league. So it's scary to see that. And especially with a guy who's as talented as Smith, you worry, he's so small and frail in a lot of ways from his build. Can he hold up? And that's one of the biggest questions that teams are going to ask and scouts are going to ask about every player is, how's this guy built? Can he add weight? Can he hold the weight? Is it good weight? Is it bad weight? How's he shaped? There's so much to unpack. And did you get to, I know you said you got to see him in practice. Did you get to see the weigh-in, or was it all private this past year?
I didn't get a chance to do the weigh-ins, but I did. He didn't practice at all, but I did see him on the sidelines and up close in person. But just like you said, like just seeing that, you like watching it and hearing, Kurt Herbstreit and all the sports pundits on TV saying how frail and how skinny he is one thing, but just seeing it up close in person for yourself, I was taken aback. So I was just like, wow, like, yeah, my calves were definitely bigger than the
Yeah, next year we got to get you to the weigh-ins. The weigh-ins, it's a weird thing to go in there, and all the guys, you're seeing them in their underwear. It's underwear, the showing. So, but it's weird to see some of these guys with how skinny they are. I would have been very curious to see how Devonta looked at the weigh-ins versus some of these other guys. So it's certainly a key part of the process for sure.
Man, if I was Devonta, I'd say, I'm going to weigh in, but do you mind if I hold my Heisman?
I had a couple extra pounds to it.
You don't mind if I hold this freaking Heisman, right? Like, you look at a number on the scale, right? That's an interesting case right there. That really is. Well, hey, let's jump over to the linebackers here. Chris Garrett out of Concordia St. Paul, Division II player, did some of his tape for the East-West Shrine game, and I mean, this guy looked like a beast coming off the edge. I mean, but competition level is quite different. We saw a guy, Quinn Meiderez, take over the Senior Bowl this year down in Mobile as well. But how difficult is it to properly assess a smaller school player? Like when you're going against different competition and it looks like a man among boys, and then taking that and putting that to the NFL.
Yeah, I would say first off, I really wish we saw Garrett at the Senior Bowl because obviously Shrine would have been a great opportunity for him. Shrine is kind of like the number 2 behind the Senior Bowl, so not having them this past year was really disappointing because you get to see him against some serious like FBS competition. It's not the killers that are at the Senior Bowl, but it's still a lot of very good players at the Shrine game, right? But not getting that opportunity really hurts. So that's one issue. And you mentioned Miners, and he's a guy who he did get that Senior Bowl invite, and we got to see how good he looked against some of the top competition. Ben Barch last year was another great example of that. So I think that's the best proving ground for those guys is you see really how they match up against those top end guys. I would also add that when you really get into those small school guys, it's tough because it takes a lot of time to really get a feel for the play speed of a player, right? Like, I don't know if you guys have done this, but like when you watch the 40s on the combine, right? And you see the number come up and you say, oh, this guy ran a 4.56 or whatever. And you really like, if you take that number away, I know sometimes they'll have the number crash and you're like, oh, what did he run? It's so tough to know what a guy runs if you don't have that number, right? It takes a lot of years to really get your eyes down, to really understand this is what 4.3 speed looks like. This is what 4.4 speed looks like. And so when you take that and you project that to smaller schools, you might have a guy who's running 4.75 at wide receiver, and he's cooking everybody. Well, he's cooking guys who run 5.2 at cornerback, so it's tough because until you've seen it a bunch, what that speed looks like, it's going to be tough to say, yeah, this guy's that level of an athlete, right? So I think that's the biggest things is one, see him against highest level of competition. Oftentimes it's going to be at an all-star game. If you're talking about a smaller school guy, so, the FCS guys, you get them against FBS a couple games throughout their career, but that showing against the top of the top guys at the Shrine and the NFLPA and Senior Bowl, that's key. And then also just having the experience to know, okay, this guy's dominating, but is he dominating because he's good or is he dominating because the opponent's bad? It takes a lot of time to get that down and know what it looks like really.
So I'm following a similar theme with our how's the spread affecting both sides of the ball questions that we've been asking here. A couple linebackers we like. Grant Stewart out of Houston, smaller, more compact, quick, great head of hair, out of Houston, flew around the Senior Bowl a little bit. And then more of a tall, leaner frame, Charles Snowden out of Virginia, almost like a basketball-like frame at 6'7", 240. 10 years ago, we might not have seen guys built quite like that, but are we seeing those different shapes and sizes at similar positions because of the spread game? Like, I mean, we're starting to see different. Are you evaluating different shapes and sizes because of that?
I'll say this. I haven't put in my report on Snowden because I'm going to be honest, I don't want to say like the crown jewel of guys I'm excited to watch, but like, I always love those height weight guys that like, it's an anomaly. You just don't see 6'7" guys at linebacker. So
why don't more crappy basketball players play football? I don't understand.
I love when I'm looking in the summer and I see all these guys and you see like a 6'6" or 6'7" guy, it gets you excited. You're like, this is going to be a unique player. This is going to teach me something.
Yeah.
About this type of player. So, but to answer your question, yeah, I think it's tough because I don't know if it necessarily relates directly to the spread and like the different types of ways we're approaching the game. But I think we have certainly seen a shift to where we see smaller linebackers. It's something that's been notable over the past, I would say, 10 years. We've seen the old school, the 6'3", 245 has become more of the 6'2", 235, 6'2", 230, because there is more priority on, hey, we got to have a guy who has good athleticism, who can be sufficient in the passing game. Not a guy who's going to be necessarily go man cover on a slot receiver, but a guy who can at least hold his own and has athleticism to make it work. I think that's certainly the biggest shift is seeing smaller guys at linebacker. Steward's a really interesting name to bring up, though, and he's one of my favorites in this class. Whenever someone asks me for a sleeper linebacker, he's the one that comes up because he's so energetic, right? You mentioned running around the Senior Bowl constantly. If you turn on his tape, I mean, he's not.
He almost blocked 2 punts in Mobile during the game, right? During the game, did he almost block a couple punts? And they're like, "What are you doing?"
Yeah, Nagy loves him because he's a special teams guy. And I'm unfortunate I don't have the special teams tape, and I don't have the knowledge on special teams to where I can give you a true breakdown on it. But one thing that I was told is when you look for guys that could be special teamers based off of just watching normal tape, is you're looking for guys that have speed, guys that have toughs, and guys that have smarts. And if you have two of those three, you need two or three to make it work. But I think Stewart's obviously one that has all three. He's got good speed. Obviously, he's undersized, only about 6 foot ish. 210, 215. So he's a smaller guy. I think he weighed in at like 225 in Mobile. I think he's probably going to play at like 215 realistically. But he's an undersized guy, but he's got the hustle. He's got good long speed to where he's going to be a 4-6 type guy. You want him out there on kickoff. He can get down the field in a hurry. He's got the toughs, obviously. I mean, he just throws himself around the field. He's getting after it. The smarts are there. It's everything you kind of want for a special teams demon from a, what I just labeled there. So he's one that I think a team could really say, you know what, 5th round, he's going to be a monster on special teams. He's probably going to be just a backup will linebacker for us. But if we need to throw him in the game, he's not going to quit on us. He's not going to get tired. He's going to run his butt off. So he's a really fun one for sure.
Did Dylan Moses hurt his stock by returning to Alabama in 2020?
I haven't put in my 2020 report on him. I'll say this, just based on what I've seen. I think some of his athleticism was lost. I don't know if I don't want to kill a guy for going back to school, right? There's so many reasons why you go back to school.
Mm-hmm.
You want to go get your degree. You want to play another season, hopefully get a national title. If his goal is, hey, let me go get a championship, more so than like worry about draft stock, then he succeeded. So I don't want to say a guy, hurt himself by going back to school ever. That's just something I'm against for the most part. But I would say that in terms of his game, it has taken a step back from what it was in the past. But it's something where, it is what it is. He decided he'd be better off coming back after missing 2019. So that's his choice. Hopefully he can still end up getting decent draft slotting and returning more to the form of what we saw earlier in his career at Alabama, but we shall see.
Roll Tide. Let's go, Rob. You got defensive backs?
Yeah, so we're gonna wrap it up with defensive backs, Mark. So this Washington Huskies secondary over the last couple of years is kind of definitely, putting its name at the DBU conversation amongst the, the Ohio States, the Alabamas, and the Floridas of the world. And one player that jumped out to me at the Senior Bowl was Keith Taylor. I just really thought he had a solid Senior Bowl with practice and everything like that. And then you have his counterpart running buddy in Elijah Molden. So it's what are we seeing, over there in Seattle from this Washington Huskies program, in the secondary, because they've been putting them out these last couple of years, and Byron Murphy, Buda Baker, and all those guys. So something is definitely working in that DB room.
Yeah, and I don't know enough about what they're coaching the guys up as and what really it's going on in that building. And so I don't want to make this is what I think, because I don't know what's going on in the building, right? I don't know what they got in the water in Washington, University of Washington. But I will say this, is they certainly, in my opinion, have a claim on DBU. I think the consistency with which they put out guys is remarkable. Every year they're putting out at least 2 guys, right? Like it's clockwork, right? Next year, looking ahead, I started adding some guys to my database, and they've got 2 corners, yep. Kyler Gordon and Trent McDuffie, and they got a safety. I don't want to mess up his name here. I think it's Asa Turner. But every year they just have 2 guys leave, they have 2 more guys come in, and next thing you know, we're talking about them as round 2, round 3 guys at worst. So they're obviously doing something right. I don't know what it is. I don't know if they're just great at recruiting or if they're great at coaching them up or what the deal is, but they're definitely in the mix for DBU, in my opinion.
Yeah, so I just want to transition into the free safety position. This is just my personal opinion. I really think, it's Richie Grant and everyone else. What other free safeties have caught your eye during this draft process?
Yeah, I really like Trevon Moehrig from TCU. I haven't put in my final grade on Richie Grant, so I want to hold off on saying from what I have seen, he's a very exciting player, one that I think I am going to have rated very highly. He's seen a little bit of a bump down the stretch here. It seems like a lot of people are starting to get on that wagon and have him possibly as the top free safety. But right now I have Moehrig because I think Moehrig, even though he's a little bit of a bigger guy, when you look at his body type, you think he's more of that box safety, but his range on the back end is really impressive. I think when he builds up his stride, he can go step for step with anyone. I like the ability. He's not a great man coverage guy, but I think there's enough to work with athletically. Good tackler, very consistent decision maker on the back end. So right now it would be Morg for me. There are a lot of guys that still need to get through. I'll say that. But maybe Richie Grant's going to usurp him when I finally finish up the eval on him.
Gotcha. So this next player, the NFL Draft Bible projects Damar Hamlin, which is the strong safety from Pitt, as an undrafted free agent, which surprised me because down at the Senior Bowl, he had a pretty decent week. He just flashed. He just kept popping out. And I just want to understand where do you project him? I know, you guys are projecting him as an undrafted free agent, but what are some tangible things that he can work on to maybe, get drafted in the later rounds in the 5th, 6th, and the 7th?
I'll say this. That's the company grade. That's the company line. I'll say that I'll let them say that on Hamlin if they want to put the UDFA on him. That's the company line. But me personally, I think Hamlin's going to be at least a 6th rounder. I think there are some questions about his frame rate. He's a little bit more of a thin-limbed guy. Yeah. He's not necessarily the most physical, but I think he's willing to stick his nose in there and be physical if you need him to. I think his tackling's pretty solid in space. There are some questions about how agile is he, in my opinion. I don't think he's the type of guy who's really going to wire you with man coverage ability. I think he's going to face some limitations there, but I think the range and the smarts and the toughness all kind of match up as a guy who you could take in the later rounds and say, yeah, he's going to be a special teams contributor as long as he can hold up physically in that regard, and he's going to be a guy who we can trust as a backup safety. I would feel comfortable taking him around round 5, round 6, based off what I've seen. So obviously the company grade's gonna be a little bit different from my own personal rankings, but I think Hamlin's a solid late rounder. He's a guy that I've been very excited about for a couple of years.
Hey, a lot of Pitt Panthers on the defensive side of the ball in this draft too, right?
Yeah. You want me to name them all?
Go shoot.
Shoot. Okay. Off the top of my head, Jalen Twyman, Keyshawn Camp went back to school. He would have been a senior this year. Patrick Jones, Rashad Weaver. They had a couple linebackers who would have went back. I think Chase Pinefield Campbell. I don't think they have any linebackers actually in this group. Paris Ford, Jason Pennock. I think their other cornerback went back to school. And then Damar Hamlin. I think that kind of rounds it out. They've got a lot of seniors who are guys that would have probably been interesting like Keyshawn Camp, but they went back. So. But yeah, like
Pat Narduzzi doing some work out in the Steel City, man.
Yeah. It's a really interesting group too, right? So like I haven't done my write-up on Paris Ford, so I can't speak too much to him. But the Weaver Jones group is really peculiar because I feel like Jones gets more attention, but I think Weaver's, I would say, the better player. I think his hand usage is further along. I think he's got more of a prototype frame. He doesn't have as much burst as Jones does, but I think he's better in terms of actually creating pressure because Jones is not a super bendy guy. He's not a guy he has small arms and he struggles to really control distance and really work his hands as a result of that. I think just from a body type standpoint, Weaver's better. I think his hands are better. Like there's a lot more that gets me excited with Weaver. And I'm seeing him talked about as a round 4 guy who's maybe a developmental guy. And I'm seeing Patrick Jones talked about as a round 2 guy who's, I don't think he's that high. I know a lot of people think he's going to be a starter early in his career. I see more of a late round, to be honest, and a guy who's going to be more of a rotational player.
And that's funny that you mentioned that, Mark, in regards to, that prototypical build. And that was one of the things. Rashad Weaver actually looks the part. So if you're going down and looking at a player, face to face, he actually has that frame and he looks the part.
Mm-hmm.
Can we just give Mark Jarvis some credit for just ripping off the Pitt Panthers off the top of his head like that? That was super impressive. I'm very impressed.
Yeah, that's why I feel good. Even if people say, "Hey, man, give me a sleeper," and I can't name anyone because they get brain freeze, just give me a team. Just give me a team and ask me for everyone on the team. I can give you that, but
so
yeah.
You live in the Cincinnati area, and we do the NFL draft because we basically cover from recruiting in through the draft, and we stay college focused. Nippert Stadium, you been?
I have not.
You've not. What's some good local college football action you've been to around there?
I'm going to be honest with you. I'm usually not going out to games as much because I've been in college for the past few years. And I didn't want to go to the games at our school because we had won like 5 games in 10 years. So I didn't want to go watch my college play football. But I'll say this. I'm very excited for next year. I'm hopefully going to catch a lot of the games at Miami, Ohio. There's a lot of MAC football that I'm excited to see there. I forget who all they're playing next year, but I know I'm going to do some advanced work and make sure I'm in the press box for some of those games in Miami, Ohio, and maybe go down to Nippert for a couple of games if I find any that I really like that I want to be at. So gonna start making a few more trips and getting around, but mostly just grinding from the lair.
I think Cincy's actually hosting Miami of Ohio, if I'm not mistaken, and then they're doing a trip up to South Bend in early October, I think. So who's the defensive coordinator? Freeman just left for Notre Dame, right? Little rematch with their defensive coordinator up there. So, hey, Mark, you got any things you want to plug before you head out?
I can name all the offensive players in the Pitt Panther. No,
let's go.
No, I'm good. All their guys went back. They had Pickett went back, Davis went back, the receivers, a lot of them went back. I mean, they just had everyone going back. So
we should just done a Pitt Panthers podcast.
I need to watch. I listen. If you guys ever have a team you want me to watch and do a podcast strictly on that, let me know. I'll watch the whole team. I'll go through and give you the breakdown on that team.
Oh, we'll take you up on that.
Definitely love that.
Just let me know. I'm down with it. I love going team by team. That's kind of my approach. So
yeah.
But yeah, nothing really that I want to plug other than go check out si.com/NFL draft. I think it's NFL. I want to make sure I'm holding the company line here and making sure I get it right. Yeah. So si.com/NFL/draft. So NFL Draft Bible on Sports Illustrated. Obviously, daily content going up on there. You can find me on Twitter at What's on Draft NFL. If you guys ever have questions, stuff you want to send at me, feel free to shoot. I'm usually able to get you an answer pretty quickly. I'm always on Twitter. Do you guys have any questions for me? Anything you want to throw out here? Because I love some of these questions about the pro days and the 247s rankings and stuff like that, and how that projects going forward with guys' careers. Anything else
just for people who are seeing this, what are the questions on Twitter where you roll your eyes and you want no part of? Just so we save you time on Twitter.
That's probably just going to draw more targets, to be honest.
Don't tell people your weak spots. Don't give them the weakness.
I'll say this. If you find me on Twitter, it used to be a lot more of, hey, here's my rankings. Here's my thoughts on this player, that player. In the past, it's gotten a lot more to, recently it's gotten a lot more into, hey, let's talk about the scouting process. Like some of the stuff we touched on with pro days and combine and, does a recruiting ranking affect how we view a guy? Or are we watching tape based on what the stats were? Are we just going straight into it and not thinking about the production at all? Those are the things I like to talk about, right? The process behind it. Not so much, hey, this one player, did you have him high or low? Ultimately, down the line, you're going to miss, you're going to hit on that, but that's not going to affect your process 5 years from now as much. It's going to be more of what's the accumulation of it? What have you learned process-wise? And so I'm always focused on putting, stuff out there on Twitter that I find from old scouting clinics, stuff that Neil Stratton does great stuff with Inside the League of having guys on who've been in the league for years and want to talk about the scouting process. There's a lot of great resources out there that talk on that, and that's something I'm always trying to push and provide, because I think a lot of people on Twitter, they see, oh, it's NFL draft time, it's March, it's the combines come around, who's the top guys on the mock draft, that sort of thing. But when you really dig into what builds an NFL team and what real scouting is, I think that's where it gets really exciting.
Do you learn a lot from watching, what percentage of work that you do on a single player is done from watching film over and over versus watching it live in person or watching the game live on TV? So I know that's probably a weird question, but
I love it. That's my favorite question you've asked tonight.
Yeah. So
I don't watch any live tape. I refuse to watch live tape because I end up wanting to sit there and rewind and rewind like I'm watching.
So you don't watch the live games?
If it's a really big game, like I'll be honest with you, like a playoff game, like an Alabama versus a Clemson or something like that.
How'd you get Alabama and Clemson? That's a random choice. I'm joking, bro.
I'll be honest with you. I'll get me some wings and I'll drink a beer and I'll just enjoy it as a fan.
Just hang out.
Just hang out. But that's a once a year type thing. I really don't watch games live like that just because I don't want to have bias going in, right? So that's the whole thing with my process. I want to make sure if I watch Trevor Lawrence for 3 years kill college football and I go in to watch him, I'm going to have 100 plays of Trevor Lawrence throwing the deep ball and just making it look easy on TV going into my evaluation. So when I sit down to watch a guy, I want to make sure it's a clean palette, right? Like there's nothing coming in that is pulling me either way. So it's certainly, I think a lot of people think that's a weird thing. I've had people ask me about it and say it's a weird thing to just not watch much live ball. But I love just rewinding constantly and making sure I'm getting every little bit out of it. I can't watch a game without wanting to take notes and write things down. So maybe that's an outlier opinion, but that's just where I come from.
Rob, trivia question. Who told us the exact same thing? on the podcast?
Wow, I'm blanking already.
Matt
Oh,
Waldman.
Waldman. Matt Waldman. Yeah.
Matt Waldman. He told us the exact same thing. So have you talked to Matt before?
I've talked to Matt here and there. I haven't had, extended conversations
He's
with him,
awesome.
but I'm a huge fan of his work. He's really
so
a
good.
pioneer, and he's in many ways what I aspire to be with my analysis, because he's the ultimate definition of a process guy, right? Like, he just does it his way, and he's got the best process that he can down over years and years of doing it. So I take a lot of notes from Waldman. I've learned a lot of things over the years from Waldman. So definitely a guy that I inspire to hopefully be like one day in terms of what I provide analysis wise.
And I would trade voices with him in a heartbeat.
And
he's
also a beard guy as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, to the listeners out there, I got mocked for my baby beard on this show. They could call me baby beard before the show, guys. See, these guys are bringing the real deal with the beards here. But so you don't watch a lot of live. That's a super interesting note. How much NFL do you watch? How much follow through do you watch on? Do you watch that? See how you did on those evals. Do you go back a year later? How about a year later? You go back on the 2019 evals and grade yourself on that, or like what you could do better? Do you learn a lot from maybe something you like? I missed that on this guy. Like, I'm going to be sure to watch out for that next year. Like, how do you do self-evaluation?
Yeah, it's tough, and it's something I want to focus more on. One of the biggest things is, prior to this past, I would say 3 months, I was in school. So like, I didn't have the time to really go back and go and dig and do self-evaluations in the level that I wanted to. I've gotten more into writing pro reports. It's something I'm starting to kind of get into, and something that I really want to focus on, because I think it gives you a lot better context to, okay, what did I miss on? What did I hit on? How was he used? How did he transform his body? Some guy's going to go from 220 in college to being 240 in the NFL. And you've got to figure out, okay, how did he make this transition? What's different about his game? So there's a lot of things you can take out that way. It's something that I need to invest more time into personally, and something I'm excited to invest more time into. I don't watch NFL live ball really at all. Like, I'm a Rams fan, and I'll be honest with you, when they were in the Super Bowl, I was like, I'll turn it on and watch it, but I'll mess around it.
We got you covered. We got you covered, Mark.
Yeah, you can double down on the Rams watching for me, because I usually like I turn on Game Pass and I'll watch some Game Pass just to, I'll write reports on guys, pro reports, but I never, even to NFL stuff, I don't watch broadcast anymore, unless it's going back and watching cut-ups, because like I said, I just really struggled to watch the game in a casual way. Like, I know Waldman obviously had a great article on that. I think it's called Losing Your Football Innocence. He shares it every few weeks on Twitter. And it's one of my favorite articles of all time, because it really, that's what it is. I've gotten to the point where if I'm going to watch football, I got my laptop up, I'm taking notes. I'm trying to learn new stuff with every single thing, every single rep. I can take something out of it and move it forward. Right. Versus if I'm just watching it on TV and I get one run through of it and I just see, oh, well, he completed the pass and that's it. I just watched the guy throw a quick pass and the play's over and I didn't learn anything. And so it just changed my way of approaching football as a whole. And it's made me, in my opinion, a lot happier watching football, to be honest. I feel like I get a lot more out of the game that way.
Why is college all 22 tape? Why do you need to know somebody in the mafia to get a copy of college all 22 tape? Why is it the most difficult thing in the world to acquire?
I'm glad I know some people in the mafia. I'll say that. But this is a very great question. One that some people treat it like a status symbol, right? Like, some people, like, they get hung up on, I don't have all 22. I can't watch this and that. It's like, well, man, for 4 years when I was doing What's on Draft, I didn't have that. I just watched broadcast and just made do. You just kind of got to make the most of what you have. I will say this. I think that they are missing a grand opportunity in terms of the audience that is out there that they could provide with this service. I think being so secretive about it and being, don't share it is really foolish, because ultimately it's just going to help the game, right? It's going to get more people interested. It's more accessible. People are going to want to take this, and hey, you can pay $60 or it's probably not going to be 60. Let's be realistic. It's probably going to be like 150 plus, but you pay this and then you can have it's like NFL Game Pass, right? You can have all this tape on all these different teams, and it would cause a boom for the NFL draft community. It would cause a boom for college analysis, right? Like, there'd be so much more out there content wise. So I think they're missing a grand opportunity. I guess it's just some fear of, we want to hoard it because we can make money off the teams and the NFL by keeping it all kind of stashed. But that's a can of worms, man. I take it like this, right? So I've made cut-ups. I've done the broadcast tape watching for a long time in terms of stuff you can find on YouTube. You just Google a player's name, Caleb Huntley versus whoever for Ball State. So like you can find stuff out there. You can make it work. If you're really invested in it, you can pull it off. But I certainly wish it was accessible to everyone.
Definitely. Rob, you got any questions?
No, I think, one of my final questions that I want to ask Mark is one thing that we talk about, just being in the scouting community and just being media as well. Pro comp comparisons. Do you like them? Do you don't like them? Like, what is your take in regards to pro comp comparisons?
This is a tough one because for years I did a version called low, medium, high, which was just give me 3 guys that they're stylistically similar. They got very similar like measurables. They meet a lot of the same things, right? They've got similar traits. They're as close as you can get as a player can get to another player, right? And so you give me a low, which is, okay, this is the floor of the guy. So, the lore on this guy might be a terrible player who's a practice squad guy, but he had similar style and similar athletic background, all that sort of stuff. Then you got the medium, which is like, okay, this is kind of what I expect him to be. And the high, which is like, okay, we'd be lucky if he gets here, right? So like a Lamar Jackson, well, maybe he could get to like a Mike Vick, which he has clearly done that. But like, that's the kind of grouping that I used. It's tough though, because you have to really dig to find good comps from like, you got to look up what's this guy's like arm length, what's his height, weight, speed. Does he play the similar way? Like there are some guys who are 6'6" and 260, and they're built a way different way than another guy who's 6'6", 260. So it's incredibly tough to find good comparisons. Personally, I've gone more in the way of not trying to use them unless it's one that really pops out. If one really clicks in my mind, I'll use it and I'll bring it up. But some people get hung up on, oh, well, is this the way you're determining the guy's success? Oh, you compared him to Aaron Rodgers. Are you saying he's going to be Aaron Rodgers? No, they're just similar in a lot of ways. So I think it's something that people overthink in a lot of ways. But it's certainly something that draws in the clicks. It's like the mock drafts. It's like the rankings and all that. It gets people's attention, but I think there's a lot of context that has to go into to find a good player comparison, and you don't want to throw them around very freely.
Gotcha.
Mark, you've been super generous with your time. We could sit here and pick your brain for another 45 minutes, dude, and I don't want to do that.
You're welcome to. No, I'm free. I love the further we've got, some of the questions you've had, I'll be honest, were some of my favorite because you really get into a lot of the process stuff, which is where I really get excited.
Right. Well, one of the things like I'm really interested in is if you're starting from, if you want, like, do you have any good book recommendations for someone who wants to learn how to scout? Because I'll see the Bill Belichick's dad's books out there all the time. That's always like the number one book I see recommended. But it is tougher than you think. If you Google how to play, how to analyze the offensive line, and you get 100 different things that are all completely different. Yeah. Like is there like, in terms of that real process, like size, like different techniques, different, like across the board, where do you I know the answer is probably just put in hours and hours and work your ass off and figure it out. I know that's the answer. But is there something where if you're just starting, like, to reference off of? So you sound like you know what you're talking about.
I know, I get what you're saying. I'll be honest with you. My approach was just hours and hours and hours and literally force yourself to learn it. So let me put it this way. For the first year and a half that I wrote scouting reports, I had very little football terminology. I was over here like, let me make sure I got the 5 tech labeled properly. Like that was the level, but I knew what I was looking at, but it wasn't necessarily like I could like label it in a way that a coach could, right? So there's no substitution to just seeing it and really putting in the work. But I will say this, there's a lot of great resources out there. I know Inside the Pylon has a lot of old stuff that they use that I know a lot of people really like. Matt Waldman obviously is a great one. Waldman's an interesting one because you get a lot of very nuanced, very detailed stuff, but he gives you in a lot of ways that are understandable to a more casual fan. He's just a phenomenal writer in that way. He'll explain the most nuanced thing of like a running back's tempo and timing in a way that makes sense to someone who's never watched a running back before. Like,
dude, he did a Nick Chubb video last season, and I watched the Browns the next week, and I was like, wow, I'm seeing, like, I saw like a whole different.
It's a different game level with Waldman. It's so many layers to it, and Waldman goes all the way down through them, and it teaches you the game in a very unique way. My thing is this: is you want to make sure, in my opinion, you're doing it your way to an extent, right? So like you're gonna learn things along the way. You're gonna have people who say, hey, maybe you didn't see it this way. Like, and that's not like you don't know what you're looking at way, but look at it from this perspective. Waldman is very good about that. There's a lot of great resources out there, but ultimately where you're going to learn the most is just doing it, where you're going to get comfortable and where you're going to really understand things, because there's no substitution to watching 10 guys and saying, okay, well, what made these 10 guys tick? Like, what did I see with them? What are my notes on them? If I missed on them, well, why did I miss? I can go back through all my old misses, and there's a lot of big ones. Like I had Kurt Benkert QB1 going way back when I first started, and I can tell you exactly why. I can pinpoint the throw that happened against Boise State where he threw it 45 yards downfield to the left side of the field, and it was just a perfect throw, and I was a little bit too tired watching him, so that was an impact. And he had a few splash plays that were really nice, so that made me skew my opinion. You can go back to when you start missing on guys, and it's going to happen. There's no avoiding that when you get into this. You're going to go to guys you missed on and say, okay, why did I miss on him? And because you did the work, you're going to understand why you missed on him, and that's going to build your knowledge. And I think that's a lot, in my opinion, more of a natural thing and a more comfortable thing to do than just taking stuff you learn from other people, because it's one thing to listen and learn. It's another thing to see it and really understand it from your own eyes. And I think that's where most of your knowledge is going to come from over time.
What type of access to resources do you have now at Sports Illustrated that you didn't have running your own show?
I got that mafia stuff. I'll say that.
Mafia stuff helps.
Yeah, and that's
So what about access to players, like interviews? I mean, I'm assuming you throw Sports Illustrated around, like talking to guys is probably a little easier, no?
No, I don't. I'll be honest. I mean, I talked about when we started the show. You could bring me in as NFL Draft Bible. Like that's just as strong of a name to me as SI. And personally, like SI obviously has a lot of power in terms of name recognition. People see that and go, "Wow, SI." It's like at the end of the day, I'm doing the same stuff I did with What's on Draft, right? Like I'm still watching players. I'm still evaluating. That's what I do, regardless of the title. I mean, it is what it is. We have a lot more accessibility to getting interviews with players, and I imagine we're going to have some more perks that come with that type of backing that SI has. But ultimately, my thing is, do I have the tape? Am I able to watch players and put in my reports? Do I have the tools I need to effectively evaluate players? Ultimately, that's what I'm concerned about. So if I have that, then I'm happy with it. And they do a pretty good job of providing us that.
That's great. That's great.
Awesome stuff right there, Mark. One of my questions before we head on out.
Keep them coming. I'm loving it.
Is, okay. So
test us.
Right now we're living in the analytical, age where everything is kind of, being thrown around with numbers. You have Pro Football Focus. You have, a lot of these analytical stuff. So I know you talked about your inherent biases as far as, not watching games and, just kind of, breaking down your players before you watch film or whatever like that. So do you buy into the analytics a little or not at all?
I think there's value in it. The question is, what do you find in it that is most valuable? How can you apply that because I'll be honest, like evaluating players is the most subjective thing I can think of in life. Like it's just what you see. Everyone's going to have a different opinion on it. So, and there's these sources, like these resources, PFF grades and stuff like that. They provide context, but they're provided in a way that they're going to provide the data, right? But you can interpret that subjectively in a lot of different ways. You can say, oh, well, this guy moved around a bunch of different spots. Well, some people are going to take that information if he played, 30% of like a Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, right? He played like 30% of his snaps in the slot and then 30% on the line and 30% is a traditional outside linebacker, whatever. Like he played all over the place. Some people are going to take that information and say, oh, well, yeah, so this shows that he's versatile and he can play a lot of spots. Some people are going to say, this shows he doesn't have a true home. We don't know where to put him. You can take that information and use it in a lot of different ways. I haven't done the work with it that I need to have a very strong opinion on analytics. It's something that I'm not comfortable with personally to where I'd want to implement it a bunch into my work. If I was with a team, I'd hire some real smart people to figure it out and help put that into our package. Because the more information you have, the better. The more you can use and implement into your process, the better. But it's something that I haven't reached a point where I'm knowledgeable enough and comfortable enough with it to where I can use that information effectively. But that said, I know NFL teams have a lot more at their disposal. They have a lot more guys who can turn all the fancy numbers that make a lot of sense to them into, I'm a caveman. They can give it to me in a way that I understand it. So that's the thing, is you got to find people who can take the information, interpret it, and provide it to you in a way that's understandable to you, where maybe you don't understand it as well. But ultimately, it all comes down to how are we going to blend this together into the most complete, as it's subjective still, but the best result we can get in the best evaluation process that we can get.
How many hours per day are you watching film?
It depends. It really does. Some
every
days,
day, 7 days a week.
Yeah. I'm gonna be honest with you. I kind of get. I don't want to say sick if I don't watch tape, but like if I go, I can take a day off, right? Like everyone takes a day off here and there, but there's never a day that goes by that I'm not thinking draft. There's never a day that goes by where I'm like, I don't want to at least get like one player watched, Some days I'll sit down and spend, 12 to 15 hours watching guys, and that's all I do all day. And then there are some days where I'll watch, 2 guys, maybe spend a few hours editing the database, do 5-6 hours, and then, hang out with the family for the rest of the time. So, but it's something that like, it's a constant,
It's dedication.
There's no dedication when you love something that much, right? Like
That's awesome.
it is what it is. Because if I wasn't doing it for a living, what I want to do with all my free time that I wasn't working on something else, I'd want to be doing this because I love it, So it's, people talk about it like it's a big dedication thing. Well, if you get to watch 15 hours a day of football, you jump on that opportunity if it presented itself,
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
If you're doing that in a heartbeat, that's a lot of fun, man. But what was the position that took you the longest to learn?
I'm still really struggling with cornerbacks. Cornerbacks and safeties are tough for me because broadcast tape, it's very tough to know just kind of the play speed that these guys have because you're not always seeing them. A lot of times when you see them, it's, a safety's coming downhill and he's already built up his speed for 15 yards. So that's one it's tough for me because I don't have as much experience because the tape I was watching before I got my hands on some of the mafia stuff. And just in general, you don't get as many teaching reps, right? So like, in my opinion, when you watch tape, you're looking for reps that tell you something about that player. There are a lot of reps that are just dead reps. Like if a quarterback is just, he takes the ball and he just hands it off real quick and there's nothing you learn about. And obviously there's some small things you can pick up on how he hands off the ball, his ability to handle snaps, but like in terms of like teaching moments, there's not much you can learn on that. Or like a linebacker who's just sitting in zone coverage and like nobody's around him. He just kind of stands there. You don't learn anything on that. But, with cornerbacks and stuff, there are a lot of reps where like ball skills, for instance, you rarely see cornerbacks ball skills. Maybe a guy only gets targeted 2-3 times a game. And then that's when you see the hand-eye coordination, the ability to track the ball in the air. There's a lot of reps that are dead reps with safeties and corners where you might have to have a safety playing deep downfield and it's a, run up the gut 3 plays in a row. You're facing a, run heavy team and he just doesn't do anything for 3 plays. Well, we didn't gain anything out of that. So
are you watching more games on those guys than you would like an offensive or defensive lineman?
Yeah. And ultimately my rule with how many games I watch on a guy is how many questions do I have left and am I comfortable with the guy, right? Like that's ultimately when I feel comfortable with like putting in my report is, did I get enough to where I've answered all the questions I have? I have a good feel of him as an athlete. Is he agile? Is he, explosive in a straight line? If a guy is a safety or cornerback, I want to see something with the ball skills. I want to see, does he track it effectively downfield? What's his technique like? I want to get a feel of everything the guy does. And once I feel like I've got a feel for that, then I'll say, okay, yeah, some guys, I don't get a good feel until 7-8 games. It's rare that happens. Usually get a good feel after a couple games. And then you finish out 3-4 games total just to make sure you do it right. But, you usually can get a good feel on a guy after about 2-3 games. I'm
sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine.
Are you more fluid with your analysis or do you have, it sounds like you almost have like a set of requirements for each position that you're looking at, like go through here, check, go through there, check.
There are different schools of thought with that in a lot of ways. I know some people say you want to have something on every little aspect of his game. There are some, like with linebackers, for instance, I know with our grading scale that we're going to have for next year for Draft Bible, and I don't want to go too in detail because they haven't divulged that publicly a ton yet, but like, for instance, linebacker with hands, right? So like a linebacker, you're not going to see a ton of reps of a linebacker playing at the catch point. So it's not something that's going to be very valuable. Now, do you want to see it? Do you want to get a feel for it? Do you want to be able to put a number on that of, is it good, bad, whatever? Yes. but I'm not going to kill a linebacker because I didn't see him at the catch point over 6 games, right? So, but I want to have a very good, like I said, I want to answer all the questions I have. If I have a question about, is this guy's burst, does he look like a 4.5 or a 4.6 guy when he's trying to close and really, explode to the point? If I'm watching a cornerback, does he have good hip fluidity? Is he a guy who's able to, if he's working in zone, can he explode to the point and really impact the catch point? There's things like that where you've got to have enough of a read on a guy to where you say, I can tell you exactly what type of athlete he is. I can tell you the technical things about him. I can tell you about some of his mental game, and I can tell you what he is. And if I can't tell you very comfortably, this is what this guy is, this is what I project him to be, whether it's a starter or backup, then I have too many questions left, and I need to continue to watch. Which sure, some people go overboard and watch, a full season on a guy, and it's like, oh, at a certain point there are marginal returns, right? So like the diminishing returns of like, okay, an extra, a 9th game might not tell you that much on a guy, but that 2nd and 3rd game is really going to tell you a lot. So it's subjective for each player, right? Like some players you're going to get a lot on in a few games. Some players you're going to like a Trey Sermon. You can tell Trey Sermon's got great contact balance and he's powerful after 1 game, and it pops off the tape. But maybe you don't see as much from him as a pass catcher. So you got to watch more to see, okay, what's he doing on these reps, or he's either, catching passes or pass blocking. So it's just about finding, like I said, those teaching reps. You might have only 3-4 in a game for a certain guy, and then 25 in another, for another guy in the same game. So you just got to take what you can out of those reps that teach you stuff on players.
All right, this is my last question here. Talking to other scouts, good thing or bad thing, and do you do it a lot? Does it turn more into arguments?
I'll say this.
Or does it bias you? Do you purposely not do it to bias you, not bias you or something?
I'm very bad about getting on Twitter. I'll say that. I'll just pull it up and click and see what's going on Twitter all the time.
You're active on there, yeah.
But I try to turn on blinders, right? And you always want to have blinders on until you put in your report, because you don't ever want to go in seeing, okay, this is what so-and-so thought on, like with Chris Sims, we talked about really early on here. I don't want to go into Kellen Mond's evaluation thinking about Chris Sims had Kellen Mond over Justin Fields. I don't want to go into an evaluation saying, well, this guy told me he's good. He told, this guy does this, and that. Well, put him on your radar, because if I know that, then I'm going to go into that looking for those things. NFL teams do this with the National and Blesto combines, these scouts, where they take the grades from the guys from the year before, the juniors that they watched, and then, cycle it over. When they give those scouts that list, they're not giving a lot of them. They're not giving the grades. They're just giving the names, because they don't want these guys to think, well, the National Scout Force graded this guy as a first rounder. They don't want them to know that. They want them to go and
explain National Blesto to our audience, because I bet you a lot of people don't know that.
Yeah. So National Blesto is a really fun one, and this is something I learned, I think, about 1.5 years ago, and it's one of the coolest things about how teams approach it is so. Not every team does it. There are, I think, of like 5 teams that aren't in this, but there's 2 groups, National and Blesto, that are, I think they call them just scouting combines, which they have, each team gives a member pretty much of like, this is our Blesto scout, or this is our National scout. And these guys, when it's in the spring and all these pro days are going on, they're doing the juniors for next year. So this year, for instance, who's a good junior who went back? So Chris Olave, right? So Chris Olave went back to Ohio State. Those guys right now are watching Chris Olave and writing him up and plugging him in for next year. So they have information. Maybe it's pro day numbers on him. Maybe it's the background a little bit, some of the medical maybe, and just generally like just basically a preview report, like an advanced report on this guy. And so teams will do that. So they have information on going into next year. Who are the guys we need to look out for? When we send our scout into Ohio State, here's the list of players that they're watching for. And that just gives them some stuff to work on, a baseline, so they're not going in there completely blind. But to circle back around to what I was kind of getting at there with that is that teams don't want their scouts to have a bias on a guy, right? They don't want to think this guy going in is a first rounder. There's a defensive end / outside linebacker. I don't want to say the guy's name because I wasn't a big fan of him this year, who got first, second round hype in the summer. And I watched him. I'm like, this guy's a UDFA. I don't see it with him. You've got to make sure every time you enter an evaluation, you're not thinking about what did so-and-so think on this guy, or what is the room temperature on this guy. You want to make sure you're giving him the grade that you feel comfortable with. And that's really where it's going to be important. So to continue to touch on this. Sorry, it's a long.
No, it's perfect.
Answer,
it's super great answer. Keep going.
But I will say this is this is why I'm so big in talking process, right?
Yeah.
Because you can talk process. It doesn't matter what day of the week it is. It doesn't matter what time of year it is. I can talk with a fellow evaluator and say, okay, well, how many games do you usually watch? Or what's your process? Are you an early note taker? Or do you like to get a game to kind of feel it out and then you take your notes? Are you a guy who writes a bunch of notes or a guy who's kind of not, taking a bunch of notes? Are you a rewinder? This is something that doesn't get talked about enough is you have some guys like myself who rewind a play 10, 15 times if I need to, because I need to get everything. If I can't get a read on this guy's burst, I'll watch until I do. If I'm trying to read, how quick did this corner close? I watch until I feel confident. This is how quick he closed. And there are some people who it's more about, okay, let me just scoot through these games real quick, and I'll see enough reps of this guy doing this to where I can pick it out and feel comfortable over seeing 7 reps of him closing rather than the 1 rep really, really confident, right? There's a lot of nuanced things like that you can talk about process-wise with other scouts in season. But in terms of I'm not asking someone about what's your thoughts on Patrick Jones or this and that until I've turned in my report. And I try to avoid always telling people hey, this is my thoughts on this guy. If you ask me, I'll tell you, but I'm not going out of my way to tell you. I'll say, hey man, you should check this guy out. He's on my radar. I had some interest in him, but I'm not going to tell you this is what I thought on this guy. I'm not going to give you a breakdown because that's up to you as an evaluator to go in there and do your own work and come to your own conclusions on that player.
Mark, this was fascinating, man. and I'm going to let you go because I don't want you to avoid our phone number when we call you again to come on this thing. But it sounds like we got a preseason preview episode brewing here. I think we could definitely give you some teams to do some college football preseason in the summer, man.
Yeah, I'll tell you this for next year. And I can't go too in detail because we haven't publicly said much, but I'm going to be covering a lot of teams in the Southeast. I'm going to have a lot of early work done on those guys. So if you have teams in the SEC that you're really looking forward to, let me know. I'm going to be watching all the seniors and the top juniors. We can do Florida first. I'm down with that. But here's my thought process, right? Is I got to cover all the seniors and all the top juniors. But if you've got guys that are underclassmen that are going to be starters, let me know and I'll throw them in there too. And we can get a full go as deep as you want on those guys.
Yeah,
so just let me know.
Awesome. Definitely got to take you up on that one, Mark.
Yeah. So last we plugged NFL Draft Bible. Anything else you want to plug before we scoot here?
Nothing else. I'm just excited for you guys to bring me back so I can ramble more on about the draft process because
this is amazing.
Now, before we let you go, Mark, this is definitely my last question. So just going back onto National and Bledsoe, I actually got a chance to kind of pick Lee Steinberg's brain at an academy conference, and he was just reiterating that it's the NFL Combine, but technically the NFL doesn't put on the Combine. It is National and Bledsoe.
Yeah.
So is that correct? Going on what you were saying earlier.
Yeah, and I think that, and I could be wrong. I've read, I would say, about 10 different articles on Bledsoe National. I've tried to do my research, but you don't find that information very easily. You got to dig a little bit for that. To my knowledge, they call them the scouting combines, but the official NFL scouting combine is put on by National, and that's where you think about the 40s. Now that's the NFL scouting combine, but it is run by National. But like I said, National is also, they have each team that is in National as a group puts in their national scout pretty much who does the juniors heading into next year. So it's kind of a two-part thing of you've got the combine itself and then you've got the advanced work that they do on the juniors. I could be wrong on that. Hopefully someone, if I'm saying anything wrong in that, I get a call later on tonight or tomorrow morning saying, hey Mark, you messed this up, and I can put out an apology, but I think that's how it works. That's my knowledge of it.
Gotcha.
That's great. Well, hey, this has been a great episode, Mark. Appreciate you joining us. Mark Jarvis, everybody, NFL Draft Bible. Check him out here. Draft season's in full swing, getting there. Skip the basketball tournament. Just go straight to the draft. Hey, Mark, we appreciate you coming on again, and we'll send you out with a word from our sponsor, CoachMate. American Football Stories is brought to you by CoachPaint. CoachPaint is a great tool that allows us to add graphics to player highlight clips similar to the graphics you see on TV. CoachPaint offers the ability to clearly tell a straight video while increasing retention of information in a shorter amount of time. Up your game with CoachPaint today.
Thank you for listening to American Football Stories podcast. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, American Football Stories. We are working to grow our network on YouTube and we'd love to have you subscribe. You can find us also on Apple Podcasts, on Twitter at American FB Story, and on our website, AmericanFootballStories.com. I am Robert Parker. My co-host is Nick Knudsen. This has been another episode of American Football Stories.